My name is Paul Hughes. About a month ago, I started working a night shift at an old Toys R Us. Yeah, that Toys R Us. The one sitting just outside town that's been closed for almost 15 years. The one with the faded draft sign. The one everyone says is haunted. Personally, I think people throw that word around too easily. Every abandoned building is supposedly haunted these days. Hospitals, schools, hotels, shopping malls. Half the internet seems convinced every creaking floorboard is proof of ghost. I've never believed any of that. Or at least, I didn't. The truth is, I wasn't looking for adventure. I wasn't chasing ghosts or urban legends. I was looking for a paycheck. I've worked plenty of overnight jobs over the years. Warehouse security, distribution center. One miserable winter watching over a self-storage facility where literally the most exciting thing that happened in 6 months was a raccoon getting trapped into Building C. Night shifts don't bother me. Honestly, I kind of prefer them. Less people, less noise. Nobody standing over your shoulder, pretending to be your boss while scrolling Facebook for 8 hours. So when I saw an opening for overnight security at an abandoned Toys R Us, I figured it'd be the easiest money I'd ever make. The listing was strange. No company name, no hourly wage, just a phone number and 5 words. Night security, immediate start. I almost ignored it. And then curiosity got the better of me. The interview lasted maybe 10 minutes. An older man named Vincent Beck sat behind a folding table in what used to be the customer service desk. Gray hair, heavy work boots, coffee stained on his flannel. He looked less like a manager and more like somebody's dad fixing a lawnmower in his garage. He glanced over my application for all of 30 seconds. "You worked nights before?" "Yeah." "You scare easy?" Not really." "You planning on quitting after one shift?" "I wasn't." He nodded once. "All right." And that was it. No background check or drug test or orientation video. He handed me a building key, told me to come back Friday at 8:30, and said I could start immediately. Honestly, I should have realized something was wrong then. Nobody hires that quickly anymore. Especially not for a job that paid almost twice what normal security work pays. Still, money's money. Friday evening, I pulled into the parking lot just before sunset. The place looked exactly how you'd imagine. Cracked asphalt, weeds growing through the parking spaces. Shopping carts scattered across the lot like they'd been abandoned in a hurry. The giant blue building had faded almost gray after years in the sun. Most of the letters had fallen off the front sign. Only R Us remained. The windows were covered from the inside with dusty brown paper. One automatic door hung halfway open. The other had been boarded shut years ago. I grabbed my flashlight and walked inside. The smell hit me immediately. Old plastic. That strange scent every toy store used to have when you were a kid. And for a second, I forgot how old I was. I was 8 again, walking through endless aisles, wondering what I was getting for Christmas. Bikes hanging from the ceiling, video games locked behind glass, rows and rows of action figures, Beanie Babies, Easy Bake Ovens, Magic 8 Balls, Cabbage Patch Kids, G.I. Joe, even Play-Doh. Everything was still there. It was like someone had locked the doors one night and simply never came back. Vincent was waiting near the registers drinking coffee. "You made it." "Yeah, place is bigger than I expected." "Well, you'll learn your way around." He started walking toward the back of the store. I followed him through aisle after aisle of forgotten toys. Most boxes were faded, corners crushed, plastic yellowed with age. Just thousands upon thousands of toys collecting dust. Finally, we reached an old employee break room. There wasn't much left inside. A vending machine, coffee maker, a folding table. 6 old security monitors showing different parts of the store. Vincent reached into a drawer, pulled out a laminated sheet, then handed it to me. Across the top in bold black letters it read, "Night Shift Rules." Underneath, 6 numbered rules. I actually laughed. "What's this?" "Our rules." "For security?" "For survival." He didn't smile. I looked back down at the page. Vincent slowly folded his arms. I've worked here 29 years. Okay. And I have watched 11 people ignore those rules. 10 of them are dead. The room suddenly felt much quieter. I stared at him for a few seconds, waiting for the punchline, but it never came. Instead, he simply looked at the old clock hanging above the coffee maker. Read 8:59 p.m. Vincent quietly took another sip of coffee, and then he said something I will never forget. You've got exactly 1 minute before the store opens. And then somewhere out on the sales floor, a child's laughter echoed through the empty building. Then, the old Toys R Us theme song began playing over the speakers. Rule 1. Never look Princess Bear in the eyes. Vincent led me into what used to be the Beanie Baby section, stopped about 6 feet from the shelves, and pointed toward a little pink bear sitting by herself. There she is. Princess Bear wasn't scary. Maybe 8 inches tall with soft pink fur, little silver crown stitched onto her head, and a stitched smile that looked almost friendly. Unlike every other Beanie Baby in the aisle, she wasn't sitting on a shelf. She had a throne. An actual throne. Somebody had built a tiny wooden chair, painted it gold, and covered the seat with red velvet. Little battery-powered lights surrounded it, like some kind of display at a museum. What is this? Her throne. Who made that? Vincent looked at me like I'd asked an obvious question. We did. You built a throne for a stuffed bear? Well, we didn't have much of a choice. I laughed. He didn't. He folded his arms and looked toward Princess without ever directly looking into her eyes. You remember the Beanie Baby craze? Yeah. My sister collected them. Yeah, everyone collected them. He nodded. People camped outside toy stores. I remember. They paid hundreds of dollars. Sometimes thousands. I remember, I said. He sighed. Well, Princess remembers too. What? She remembers being one of the most desired toys in all of America. I looked back toward the little pink bear. Vincent continued. She doesn't think she was special. She thinks she is special. The most valuable Beanie Baby ever made. The queen of this store. I smirked. Okay, so she's got an ego. Calling it an ego is like calling the ocean a puddle. He finally looked at me. Princess believes every toy here exists to serve her. And us? I asked. Oh, we're beneath her. Seriously? As serious as I've ever been. He pointed toward her face. Never look her in the eyes. Why? Because she considers eye contact disrespectful. If you look her directly in the eyes, she believes you're challenging her. I couldn't help it. I laughed again. A stuffed bear. Vincent didn't react. The problem is that she'll get very angry. She'll hold a grudge. For how long? He shrugged. Until she feels you've suffered enough. Well, after Vincent's little talk, the rest of the first hour went by without much happening. I checked emergency exits, tested a few security cameras, made sure nobody had broken into the building. Every now and then I'd catch myself glancing toward the Beanie Baby aisle. Princess never moved. She just sat there on her ridiculous little throne. Around 10 o'clock, Vincent asked me to grab a mop from the janitor's closet near the back of the store. The quickest route took me past Princess. I remember the rule. Eyes down, simple. As I walked past, something hit the floor behind me. A soft little thump. I stopped, turned. One of the Beanie Babies had somehow fallen off the shelf. It was a little brown dog lying in the middle of the aisle. Huh. Probably vibrations. Old shelves, old building. I bent over, picked up the dog, and turned toward the display. And that was my mistake. For maybe half a second, I looked directly into Princess Bear's eyes. They weren't ordinary plastic eyes anymore. They seemed focused, watching me. Neither of us moved, and then she smiled. Not the stitched smile she'd always had. A new smile. She tipped her head toward me, the tiniest nod imaginable, and I felt every hair in my arm stand up. And then she was still again, exactly like before. I stood frozen until Vincent's voice came from behind me. You looked... You looked... It was an accident. He closed his eyes for a second, and then muttered something under his breath. What? I was hoping that you'd make it at least one night. I looked back towards Princess. She hadn't moved. I swear she smiled. I know. So, now what? Vincent took a long sip of coffee. Well, now she hates you. You're kidding. I wish I was. Nothing happened for another 10 minutes. I actually started feeling embarrassed. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the lighting had played tricks on me. Then my flashlight disappeared. I'd left it on a shelf while checking a fire extinguisher, and 30 seconds later, just gone. Vincent found it sitting neatly on Princess's throne. Neither of us had walked anywhere near the aisle. An hour later, my ring of keys vanished. We searched almost the entire store before finding them hanging from the antlers of a stuffed moose 3 aisles away. And then every security camera in the break room switched to the same camera. Camera 12. The Beanie Baby aisle. Princess was staring directly into the lens. She's playing with you, Vincent said. That's all? For now. And the rest of the night became a parade of little disasters. Shelves I'd already organized were suddenly knocked over. Doors I knew I'd locked somehow swung open. My radio kept turning itself on, and once, just once, a soft female voice came through the speaker. You should bow. And then the radio went dead. Vincent simply reached over, turned it off, and handed it back to me. Like I said, she took it personally. Well, by sunrise, nothing truly terrible had happened yet. I was exhausted, frustrated, embarrassed. Princess hadn't tried to kill me. She'd simply spent the entire night making my job as miserable as possible. As we headed for the exit, I glanced toward the Beanie Baby aisle one last time. Not at her face, just toward the throne. Princess was sitting exactly where she'd been when the night started. Perfect posture and smile, like she'd enjoyed every minute of it. Rule 2. Never burn the cookies. I asked Vincent what cookies had to do with overnight security, and he told me to follow him. Near the back of the store, between the old dolls and the toy kitchens, there was an entire section filled with easy-bake ovens. Most were still sealed inside faded boxes. A few had been opened and arranged on a long display table with tiny baking pans, plastic mixing bowls, and packages of powdered cake mix that had expired sometime before I finished high school. One oven sat by itself in the middle. It was pink and purple, with a white handle and a little yellow light glowing inside. Unlike everything else in the store, it looked clean. There wasn't a speck of dust on it. Beside it sat a mixing bowl, a wooden spoon, and a plate covered with a folded dish towel. Vincent pulled the towel back. 6 small chocolate chip cookies sat underneath. They were barely bigger than quarters. You bake these every night? I asked. Every night. For who? He looked out toward the aisles. Them. He opened a cabinet beneath the display and showed me dozens of small plastic containers. Flour, sugar, chocolate chips, everything measured and labeled. There was even a handwritten recipe taped to the inside of the door. The instructions were simple. Mix the dough, make 6 cookies, bake them for 11 minutes, let them cool for 5, and then leave them on the blue plate beside the oven. I looked around the empty section. Nothing moved. A row of baby dolls stared down from the shelf behind us. A plastic kitchen set sat beneath a faded sign that promised hours of imaginative fun. I picked up one of the cookies and it looked normal. Vincent took it out of my hand and placed it back on the plate. Don't eat their food. I wasn't going to. You were thinking about it. I was looking at it. Well, look with your eyes. I told him he was beginning to sound like my mother. He ignored that. Every night at 10:30, the cookies had to go into the oven. Not 10 or 11, 10:30. Vincent said the toys liked routine. The store had its own schedule, and the longer someone worked there, the easier it was to understand. Princess Bear expected her throne cleaned before 10. The Cabbage Patch Kids became active sometime after midnight. G.I. Joe took his position near the entrance at 9:15, and at 11 o'clock, the toys expected cookies. That was simply how things worked. Do all of them eat? I asked. Not all of them, he replied. The first few nights, Vincent handled the baking. He moved slowly and carefully, like someone performing maintenance on an expensive machine. He measured every ingredient, mixed the dough until it was smooth, divided it into 6 equal pieces and placed them on a little metal tray. Then he set a timer. He never left the section while the cookies were inside. And at exactly 11 minutes, he pulled them out. Perfect every time. The smell spread through the store almost immediately. Warm sugar, chocolate, something familiar and comforting. Made the old building feel different, less abandoned. Well, for 5 minutes the store remained quiet, and then the toys began arriving. Not many. A few Smurfs appeared first. They came from behind a shelf and stood near the table with their hands behind their backs. 2 Cabbage Patch Kids followed them. They sat on the floor and waited. A stuffed dog dragged itself out of the pet aisle. A plastic dinosaur watched from behind a display. Even Princess Bear appeared at the far end of the section, carried on her throne by 4 smaller Beanie Babies. Nobody touched the cookies until Vincent stepped away. Then the lights flickered, and when they came back on, the plate was empty. The toys were gone. That happened every night. No noise or fighting, no mess. Just missing cookies and a few crumbs on the plate. After a week, Vincent told me it was my turn, and I followed the recipe exactly. At least I thought I did. The dough looked right. The tray went in at 10:30. I set the timer for 11 minutes and I stood right beside the oven. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. And then Vincent called me over the radio. There was a problem with one of the back doors. The alarm kept showing it as open, even though we'd already checked it twice. I told him I was watching the cookies. He said we had time. We didn't. The door was fine, the alarm had malfunctioned, but by the time I returned to the Easy Bake section, the smell had changed. The sweet smell was gone. In its place was something dry and bitter. Smoke curled from the little oven. I pulled the tray out, and all the cookies were burned through. Little circles of charcoal. Vincent arrived behind me, looked at the tray, then looked at the clock. It was 2 minutes before 11. Can we make another batch? I asked. He shook his head no. The store became quiet then. Not gradually, all at once. The music playing over the speakers stopped in the middle of a song. The humming from the lights seemed to fade. Even the old building settled. Vincent picked up the tray and placed it on the blue plate. What are you doing? Following the routine. You're giving them burnt cookies? Oh, they already know. The smell had reached the other aisles. I could tell because things began changing. A doll somewhere nearby started crying. A toy train turned itself on and rolled slowly around its track. One of the security gates near the front entrance lifted halfway and dropped again. And then came the footsteps, small and soft, dozens of them. The Smurfs arrived first. They stood beneath the display and looked at the plate. One of them picked up a cookie, tapped it against the table, and let it fall. It made a hard clicking sound. The Cabbage Patch Kids appeared next. They sat in a line across the aisle. None of them smiled. The stuffed dog came out from beneath a shelf and sniffed the plate, then backed away quickly. More toys filled the section. Action figures, stuffed animals, baby dolls, plastic animals. They formed a wide circle around the table. Princess Bear arrived last. Her throne stopped directly across from me. I kept my eyes lowered this time. Even without looking at her face, I could feel her attention. Vincent stepped forward, cleared his throat. "I'm sorry. This new employee made a mistake." I glanced at him. "You're blaming me, huh?" "Oh, be quiet." One of the Cabbage Patch Kids picked up a cookie, broke the cookie in half. The inside was completely black. The doll looked at me, and then every toy in the section slowly turned its head in my direction. And I understood then. They were angry because the cookies mattered to them. It was part of the night. Maybe the only pleasant part. The store was dark, old, and filled with things that had been forgotten. Most of these toys had once belonged to children. They'd been carried home, played with, loved, and eventually left behind. The cookies were something they still expected. Something normal and good. And I had ruined it. I looked at Vincent. What do I do? "I'll make another batch." "You said there wasn't time." "There wasn't," he said. Well, I was confused, but I started mixing, and the toys watched every movement. I measured the ingredients twice, added the chocolate chips, rolled the dough carefully. My hands were shaking, but I kept going. The second batch went into the oven, and this time I stayed beside it. No alarms or doors or distractions. 11 minutes later, I removed the tray, and the cookies were perfect. Golden around the edges, soft in the middle, and I placed them on the blue plate and stepped back. Well, for several seconds nobody moved, and then the little stuffed dog walked forward and sniffed one. A Smurf tore off a small piece. The Cabbage Patch Kids began smiling again. The toys slowly scattered. Princess Bear remained for a few seconds longer, and then her throne turned and disappeared into the next aisle. Vincent waited until we were alone. "Now you understand." I looked at the burnt cookies still sitting on the floor. "Yeah." He picked up the tray and handed it to me. "Good, because tomorrow night you're baking again." After that, I never left the oven unattended, not even for a second. That was rule 2. Never burn the cookies. The toys didn't ask for much yet, but they remembered every disappointment. Rule 3. Never leave your keys on the counter. Now, out of all 6 rules, this one's probably the easiest to follow. It also happens to be the one most new employees break first. Not because they don't believe it, because they forget. It started on my 4th night. Princess Bear had mostly stopped tormenting me. She'd still pull the occasional prank, like moving my flashlight or switching security cameras while I wasn't looking, but nothing compared to that first shift. I figured I'd finally earned a little peace. I was wrong. Around 11:30, Vincent asked me to unlock the loading dock so we could bring in a shipment of cleaning supplies. I walked into the break room, unclipped my keys from my belt, set them on the counter while I poured myself a cup of coffee, and spent maybe 30 seconds adding cream and sugar. 30 seconds. When I turned around, they were gone. I frowned. I looked beneath the coffee maker. Nothing. Checked my pockets. Nothing. Even looked inside the refrigerator. Still nothing. "Hey, Vincent. I lost my keys." He didn't even look up from the security monitors. You left them on the counter, didn't you? Yeah. Well, they've got them now. He looked at me like I'd already asked a stupid question once that week. Who? I asked. The Cabbage Patch Kids. He pointed toward the hallway. Oh, you're going to learn something. We walked into the toy section together. Unlike Princess Bear's aisle, this part of the store felt lived in. Little toy dishes were scattered across shelves. Tiny chairs had been moved into circles. Blankets had been built into forts beneath display tables. Looked less like abandoned merchandise and more like a daycare after everybody had gone home. Vincent smiled. They're harmless, mostly. They've never killed anybody. Oh, that's comforting. They have caused 3 divorces. What? Well, they're very good at stealing wedding rings. I wasn't sure if he was joking anymore, honestly. I wasn't sure about anything in that store. We rounded the corner and entered the old Cabbage Patch display. Had to be 50 of them. Different hair and clothes and expressions. Every one of them sitting perfectly still, watching us. Vincent crouched beside one little girl with bright red yarn hair. Well, good evening there. Nothing happened. He smiled. Well, Paul here, he made a mistake tonight. Still nothing. He left his keys on the counter. The doll didn't move. Neither did the others. Vincent stood back up. Now we wait. For what? I asked. They're deciding. They don't like giving things back right away. Well, 5 minutes passed. Nothing. And then somewhere deeper in the aisle, I heard giggling. Not loud, just enough to make me turn my head. A little blue Smurf darted between 2 shelves. Then another. They work together? I whispered. Vincent nodded. The Smurfs are their partners. I watched one tiny Smurf climb onto a shelf, wave at another one across the aisle, and then disappear carrying something over his shoulder. Another 10 minutes passed before Vincent finally motioned for me to follow him. He led me through the dolls, past Barbie, past Polly Pocket, past the old Fisher-Price toys, until we reached a little plastic tea set sitting in the middle of the floor. Around it sat 12 Cabbage Patch Kids. They were having tea, tiny plastic cups and plates and cookies, and my keyring sat right in the middle of the table. One little doll had looped the keys around her neck. Another was pretending to stir coffee with them. A Smurf stood proudly beside the teapot, wearing my employee badge like a cape. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. Can I just take them? Vincent grabbed my arm before I could step forward. No. Why? You weren't invited. What happens if I interrupt? He shrugged. They'll cry. They'll cry very loudly. And then the whole store will get upset, and you don't want that. I slowly lowered my head. We stood there for another few minutes. One of the dolls poured pretend tea into an empty cup. Another offered a cookie to the Smurf. The Smurf bowed dramatically before accepting it. Eventually, the red-haired doll stood up. She walked across the table, carrying my keys with both hands, stopped about 6 feet away, held them out, and then quickly pulled them back behind her. The others burst into laughter, even the Smurfs. The doll repeated the game 3 more times before finally placing the keys on the floor. I picked them up. On the way back, I clipped the keys very securely onto my belt. I don't understand them. Vincent looked over at me. They're not evil, you know. They're just children. The strange thing was, he was right. Over the next couple of weeks, I realized the Cabbage Patch Kids never stole anything important. Just inconvenient things. Keys, pens, tape measures, flashlights. One night, they took Vincent's reading glasses. We found them sitting on a teddy bear, wearing them upside down. Another night, they stole my lunch. Not to eat it, to set up a picnic for every stuffed rabbit in the building. The Smurfs always helped. They were ridiculously fast. Sometimes I'd only catch a flash of blue disappearing beneath a shelf before realizing something had gone missing. Eventually, I learned if you kept your belongings clipped to your belt, they'd leave you alone. If you set something down, though, even for a second, it became part of whatever game they were playing that night. A week later, I made the mistake again. Just for a moment, I set my keys on the counter while answering the radio. When I turned back, they were gone. I sighed, walked toward the doll aisle, and before I even reached it, something tapped against my boot. I looked down, and my keys were sitting neatly on the floor. They ran away laughing. I smiled despite myself. When I told Vincent, he chuckled. "Why are they always stealing?" I asked. He thought about it for a moment. I think they just don't want the store to feel lonely." And that was rule 3. Never leave your keys on the counter, because if you do, the Cabbage Patch Kids will absolutely borrow them. And maybe they'll give them back eventually. Rule 4. Never ask the Magic 8 Ball when you'll die. Out of every toy in the building, the Magic 8 Ball bothered me the most. Not because it moved or because it came alive. Almost never did either of those things. It simply answered questions. The old promotional display still sat near the electronics department, right beside the board games. It wasn't one of the little handheld Magic 8 Balls you shook as a kid. This thing was enormous. Almost 2 feet across, mounted on a black pedestal with faded yellow lettering around the base. Its surface was scratched from years of customers putting their hands on it. The blue liquid inside looked darker than I remembered. Every night as I made my rounds, I'd find myself slowing down when I reached that aisle. A giant black sphere sitting quietly beneath the old lights. The first week I ignored it. The second week, curiosity got the better of me. I started asking harmless questions. Nothing important. Would it rain tomorrow? The answer floated into view. Yes. It rained the entire next day. Another night, I asked if the Browns would ever win the Super Bowl. After a few seconds, outlook not good. A few days later, I asked whether the vending machine still had peanut butter crackers inside. Without a doubt, it said. And it did. The answers weren't immediate. The liquid always had to settle first. The little white triangle would slowly drift upward through the dark blue liquid until the words became clear enough to read. Every answer came back correct. Eventually, I stopped trying to prove it wrong. I couldn't. The thing simply knew. Didn't matter whether the question was about tomorrow or 5 seconds from now. It always knew. And that should have been enough. For any normal person, it would have been. But human beings are curious by nature. If someone puts a button in front of us and tells us never to press it, sooner or later we're going to wonder why. I kept thinking about the rule. Never ask the Magic 8 Ball when you'll die. Not don't touch it or don't ask questions. Just don't ask that one. It sat in the back of my mind for days. Every time I walked past that aisle, I'd find myself looking at it a little longer than before. I'd imagine the answer. Maybe it gave a date, a location, maybe just a number. Whatever it was, people clearly weren't supposed to know. I started wondering what I'd do if I found out. Would I live differently? Would I become more careful? Or would it ruin every day I had left? The question stayed with me. One night, while checking camera feeds in the break room, I found myself staring at the monitor showing the electronics aisle. The Magic 8 Ball was the only thing on the screen. Everything around it looked abandoned. Old video game displays, DVD players, portable CD players, technology nobody wanted anymore. The ball sat perfectly in the middle, waiting, like it knew I'd come back. And near the end of my shift, I finally did. The store was unusually quiet. Even the Cabbage Patch Kids had disappeared for the night. I stood in front of the pedestal for almost a full minute without touching it, and then I placed both hands on the smooth plastic shell. It felt cold, much colder than it should have, and I gave it a gentle shake. The liquid swirled slowly, and I asked the first thing that came to mind. Will I still be working here next month? The triangle drifted upward. Most likely. I smiled a little, another shake. Will this place ever close for good? The answer took longer this time. Don't count on it. Now, the building had been scheduled for demolition for years. Every newspaper article said the same thing. Every city meeting ended with another delay. Maybe that was a coincidence. Maybe not. I rested my hand on top of it. The forbidden question came back into my mind. I knew better, I honestly did, but curiosity is a difficult thing to silence, especially when you're standing alone in an empty toy store at 3 a.m. I opened my mouth. When will... I stopped. I hadn't finished. I hadn't even reached the last word. The liquid inside the magic 8-ball exploded into motion, not from another shake. On its own, dark blue waves spun violently beneath the plastic window. The triangle shot upward so fast it struck the glass. And then it stopped. The words appeared, "You will regret asking." I never touched the magic 8-ball again. I still walked past it every night. Sometimes the liquid inside seemed to move ever so slightly as I passed. Sometimes I thought I could see the white triangle rising beneath the surface before sinking back into the darkness. I never stopped to find out. Some questions don't make your life better. Some answers don't set you free. Rule 5. Never eat the Play-Doh. If someone handed you a container of Play-Doh and told you not to eat it, you'd probably laugh. I think maybe every kid tries it once. Smells good, looks harmless, taste terrible. Lesson learned. That wasn't why the rule existed. The Play-Doh in this store wasn't the same stuff I remembered growing up. At first glance, it looked identical. Rows of little yellow tubs stacked on old display shelves. Red, blue, green, purple, orange. Nothing unusual. But after a few weeks, I started noticing something. The colors never stayed in the same place. I'd organized the shelf before sunrise, and by the following night the order had changed. Not by much. Maybe the blue had traded places with the green. Maybe one yellow container had moved from the top shelf to the bottom. It was subtle enough that I questioned my own memory. And then I started paying attention. One night, I lined every container into perfect rows. The next evening, the rows were crooked again. Nobody else had been inside the building. Nothing should have moved. I decided to watch them. Not all night, just for a while. I pulled up one of the security cameras that overlooked the arts and crafts section, and I left it running while I made my rounds. An hour later, I came back. Everything looked normal. I rewound the recording, and for almost 50 minutes, nothing happened. Then, without warning, every single container shifted. Not much, less than an inch. Just enough to scrape slowly across the shelf. Then they stopped. 10 minutes later, they moved again, and it looked almost coordinated, like dozens of people taking one careful step at exactly the same time. I watched the footage 3 times before shutting the monitor off, and after that, I stopped thinking of them as containers. I started thinking of them as something hiding inside containers. That thought stayed with me. A few nights later, I noticed something else. The smell. Fresh Play-Doh has a smell everybody remembers. Salty. Kind of chemical, kind of doughy. This wasn't that. This smelled warm. Like fresh bread coming out of an oven. The closer I walked toward the shelf, the better it smelled. Warm cinnamon rolls. Chocolate cake. Fresh pizza. Whatever happened to sound good at that particular moment? The smell kept changing. One second, I'd swear someone was baking cookies, and then the next it smelled like garlic bread, then barbecue and fresh brownies. It was impossible. Plastic shouldn't smell like food, especially not every kind of food. I found myself standing in front of the display longer than I meant to. The smell was comforting, inviting, reminded me of childhood kitchens, family dinners, holiday meals. The longer I stood there, the hungrier I became. My stomach actually growled. I remember laughing to myself. Whatever chemicals were trapped inside those old containers had probably broken down over the years. That had to be it. Then I noticed one of the lids was slightly open, only by a fraction of an inch. I reached toward it without thinking. Halfway there, I stopped. The rule flashed through my mind. Never eat the Play-Doh. I wasn't planning to, I just wanted to look. I carefully lifted the lid. Inside sat a lump of bright blue Play-Doh, perfectly smooth, no fingerprints or cracks, looked brand new. The smell immediately became stronger, warm blueberry pie. I leaned closer. Something moved. Not the container, the Play-Doh itself. The surface rose ever so slightly, then settled back down, like something taking a slow breath. I stared for several seconds, then convinced myself I'd imagined it. I started lowering the lid, and before it closed, the Play-Doh moved again. This time there was no mistaking it. A tiny bump traveled beneath the surface from one side of the container to the other, like something crawling underneath a blanket. I dropped the lid. The sound echoed through the aisle. Everything became quiet. I backed away. As I turned to leave, I heard the softest little pop behind me, almost like someone removing the lid from another container. Then another. I looked back, and 3 lids now stood slightly open. I knew they hadn't been before. The smell filled the aisle again. Fresh bread, warm butter, apple pie. I walked away, faster this time. The following evening, I checked the shelf again, and every lid was closed. Everything looked perfectly normal. For a while, I wondered if I really had imagined it. And then I noticed tiny blue footprints. Not on the shelf. On the floor. They were no bigger than my thumbnail. Little footprints made entirely of blue Play-Doh. They disappeared beneath another aisle. I followed them. They continued through crafts, past the puzzles and coloring books, and finally they stopped beneath an old display table. I knelt down, and at first I didn't see anything. And then my eyes adjusted to the darkness. Dozens of tiny Play-Doh people stared back at me. Each one stood only 3 or 4 inches tall. Different colors, different shapes. None of them had mouths. Just little tiny eyes pressed into soft faces. Nobody moved or blinked. They simply watched me. One of them raised a tiny hand and waved. Every little figure ducked beneath the table and disappeared into the shadows. The next morning I checked again, and nothing. No footprints or figures, no sign they'd ever been there. Only a faint smell of fresh bread lingering beneath the shelves. And after that, I began noticing tiny things around the store. Little fingerprints pressed into dusty windows. Colored smears on the floor that vanished by the next night. Half-inch footprints leading into air vents. It was as if hundreds of tiny Play-Doh people wandered the building after dark, cleaning up after themselves before sunrise. They never bothered me, and I never bothered them. We seemed to have an understanding. Rule 6. Always salute G.I. Joe. By my 3rd week, I had settled into a routine. The front door is unlocked every night at exactly 9. The lights came on. The old Toys R Us music drifted through the speakers. I made my rounds, checked the emergency exits, baked the cookies, kept my keys clipped to my belt, avoided Princess Bear, ignored the magic 8-ball, stayed away from the Play-Doh aisle. Most nights were strange, but very few were dangerous. For a while, I actually started believing the store had accepted me. I should have known better. Well, that night started differently. Even the toys seemed quieter than usual. Princess remained on her throne. The Cabbage Patch Kids stayed hidden. I never saw a single Smurf. It was as though everyone inside the building was waiting for something. Around 11, I noticed G.I. Joe standing near the front entrance. He always stood there. Plastic rifle across his chest, green helmet, perfect posture. Every night before beginning my rounds, I'd stop beside him and salute. It'd become habit. I wasn't even sure why anymore. Maybe it was respect or superstition. Whatever the reason, I never skipped it. Well, that night, I saluted him like always. I smiled to myself and continued walking. An hour later, I heard breaking glass. Not one window, several. The sound echoed through the entire store. I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward the collectibles section. Nothing. The glass display cases were intact, no broken shelves or windows. And then I heard it again. This time, there was laughter. It wasn't coming from the hallway, it was coming from the loading dock. I hurried toward the back of the building. The large steel door stood wide open. Cold night air drifted inside. Wooden shipping crates sat scattered across the floor. I didn't remember seeing them earlier. There had to be 20 of them. Every one stamped with the same faded label. Classic Monster Collection. One crate rocked gently. Another tipped down to its side. Then, a nail slowly pushed itself out of the wood. Another. The lid lifted by itself. A pale hand reached over the edge. Long fingers, sharp nails. And then a man climbed out. Tall, thin, dressed in an old black suit. He smiled at me. Behind him, more crates opened. A wolf with yellow eyes stepped out of the concrete. A mummy slowly unwrapped itself. Something stitched together from different bodies dragged itself upright. The old monster toys weren't toys anymore. They looked alive. They looked hungry. I backed away, and the vampire took one slow step forward, then another. The wolf sniffed the air. The mummy disappeared between two aisles. Somewhere nearby, shelves began crashing to the floor. The store erupted into noise, and I turned and ran. The first thing I noticed was Princess Bear. She wasn't on her throne anymore. 4 beanie babies were carrying it away as fast as they could. She never looked in my direction, but she was leaving fast. The Cabbage Patch Kids rushed past carrying armfuls of toys, and the Smurfs disappeared beneath shelves. Even the tiny Play-Doh people abandoned their hiding places, slipping into air vents one after another. Everything in the store was running. Everything except G.I. Joe. He stood perfectly still beside the front entrance, exactly where he'd always been. I reached him just as the vampire rounded the corner toward me. And for some reason, the rule popped in my head. Always salute G.I. Joe. So I raised my hand and I saluted. Nothing happened. For one terrible second, nothing. And then I heard the click. Tiny, metallic. G.I. Joe's head turned. His eyes blinked. He lowered his rifle from his shoulder. And he returned the salute. The vampire stopped walking. The smile disappeared from his face. G.I. Joe stepped forward then, one plastic boot at a time. He couldn't have been more than a few inches tall, yet somehow, the entire store felt different. He reached into a tiny backpack and pulled out a grenade no bigger than a marble. He pulled the pin, threw it. The explosion sounded far larger than anything that size should have produced. The blast knocked the vampire backward through an end cap display, and at the same moment, movement erupted throughout the toy department. Green plastic army men climbed from old buckets. Dozens, then hundreds. Some carried rifles, others machine guns. Tiny tanks rolled across the floor. Little jeeps raced through the aisles. A toy helicopter lifted into the air with spinning blades. And within seconds, an entire army stood behind G.I. Joe. The vampire stood again,
So did the wolf. The mummy emerged from another aisle. More monster figures appeared from the loading dock. And the battle began. Gunfire echoed through the store. Tiny flashes lit the darkness. Grenades burst beneath shelves. Plastic tanks fired again and again. The wolf leaped over an aisle and landed in the middle of the soldiers. 3 army men tackled it immediately. The mummy wrapped itself around a helicopter and dragged it from the air. The vampire tore through an entire squad before G.I. Joe met him head-on. One of the soldiers pointed for me to go towards the front doors then. They were still open. I looked back one last time, and G.I. Joe stood alone on top of a fallen display case. His helmet was gone. One sleeve had been ripped open. He raised his rifle again, never once looking away from the monsters. I stood at the doorway, raised my hand, and gave him one final salute. Without turning around, he returned it, then charged straight into the darkness. I stepped outside. The automatic door slid shut behind me. The fighting continued inside for hours. Gunfire, explosions, crashing shelves. Every now and then the building shook, and just before sunrise, everything stopped. I came back the next evening. The store looked almost normal. Shelves had been restocked. Displays stood upright. The loading dock was closed. The monster crates were locked behind heavy chains inside a fenced storage cage at the back of the warehouse. Whatever had happened, the toys had won. I walked to the front entrance. G.I. Joe stood in his usual place. His rifle rested across his chest. One arm was wrapped in a tiny sling made from white cloth. His helmet had been replaced with one that didn't quite match the rest of his uniform. There were scratches across his boots. A crack ran through the plastic on one shoulder. He looked tired. If a toy could look tired. I raised my hand, said thank you, and saluted. The strange thing is, life eventually settled into something that almost felt normal. Not normal by anyone else's standards, obviously, but normal for that store. Princess Bear still ruled over the Beanie Baby aisle, with the same oversized ego she'd probably had since the 90s. Every night I'd lower my head as I walked past her throne. She never acknowledged me. I figured that was good. The Cabbage Patch Kids still stole anything foolish enough to be left unattended. Every now and then, I'd discover my flashlight sitting in the middle of one of their tea parties, or find my clipboard covered in childish crayon drawings. The Smurfs always seemed to be involved somehow. They'd scatter the moment I caught a glimpse of them, laughing all the way beneath the shelves. The Easy Bake Oven never missed another batch of cookies, I made sure of that. The Magic 8-Ball stayed exactly where it always been. Sometimes I'd catch myself looking toward it as I walked by, wondering what it already knew about tomorrow. I never asked another question. And the Play-Doh. Every now and then I notice another tiny thing sitting quietly on the shelf. Sometimes blue, sometimes green. Once, a little yellow lighthouse. I always left him exactly where I found him. Seemed rude not to. As for G.I. Joe, he never left his post near the front entrance. The little sling disappeared after about a week. The cracks in his shoulder, though, they stayed. So did the scratches across his boots. Every evening before my shift started, I'd unlock the front doors, switch on the lights, wait for the old Toys R Us music to begin playing, and give him a salute. It became the first thing I did every night. All kinds of things would happen after dark. But by sunrise, the store would usually be quiet again. That's the funny thing about working somewhere like that. Eventually you stop wondering why any of it exists. You stop asking questions. You stop hoping things will go back to normal. Instead, you learn the rules, and you survive one night at a time. The call came in while I was locking the rear door of the sheriff's office. "Sheriff Russell," I said into the radio.
"We've got a missing child,"
Dispatcher Harlan said.
8-year-old male. Last seen about 20 minutes ago near the retention basin off Larcombe Road.
I stopped where I was. The key stayed half turned in the lock. "Name?" I asked.
"Nolan Rigg.
Harlan replied.
Didn't come home when he was told. Neighbor saw him riding a blue bike near the basin."
"I'm on my way," I said.
"Deputy Bullock is already en route,"
Harlan replied. That was enough to move. I locked the door, crossed the lot, and got into my cruiser. The engine turned over on the first try. I pulled out with the lights on and headed east, past the grain elevator and the closed feed store, then out onto the stretch of road where houses thin out and fields take over. Larcombe Road runs straight for a mile, then drops into a shallow basin where the county carved out a retention pond decades ago. It's not a scenic place. It's a low spot designed to hold water when the rain comes down hard enough to overwhelm the ditches. The pond sits in a concrete bowl surrounded by reeds and tall grass, with storm drains feeding into it from 3 directions. A handful of houses sit back from the road behind long gravel drives. An old baseball field borders the far side, its backstop bent and its dugouts half collapsed. When I crested the dip, I saw the lights before anything else. Deputy Bullock had her cruiser angled across the shoulder, headlights cutting across the grass and the concrete lip of the basin. A woman stood in the beam with both hands locked on top of her head. A small blue bicycle lay on its side near the mouth of a culvert. I parked behind her and stepped out. Bernice Bullock was standing near the front of her cruiser, facing the culvert. She was 5'2", late 40s, about 110 pounds on a good day. She didn't fill space, and she didn't draw attention to herself. What she did was stand still and watch. She'd been with the department long enough that I didn't need to ask what she'd already noticed. "Sheriff," Bernice began. "Bike's his. Culvert entrance is open. Mom's right there." I nodded and walked past her toward the woman in the headlights. "Ma'am," I said, "I'm Sheriff Russell. Is Nolan your son?" "Yes," the woman said. "He was just outside. He was just right here. I told him to stay where I could see him. He was riding his bike back and forth, and I went inside to check dinner. When I came back, he was gone." "About how long were you inside?" I asked. "I don't know. A few minutes." Okay. What was he wearing?" "Red shirt," she said. "Gray shorts, black shoes." I nodded once and stepped away so Bernice could move in and keep her focused. I walked back toward the bike and crouched. The chain was still on the gear. The front wheel was turned hard to the left, like it'd been dropped without slowing. One handlebar grip was scuffed. The grass around it was pressed flat in a short line, leading toward the culvert opening. The culvert fed into the retention pond under the road. The metal grate that should have covered the opening had been bent outward years ago. Its bolts rusted and snapped. Inside, the concrete sloped down to a narrow ledge above shallow water. The tunnel curved out of sight after about 20 feet. I stood and keyed my radio. "Harlan," I said, "confirm fire and EMS are rolling. I want volunteer fire with lights. I want units from the next township for perimeter."
"Copy,"
Harlan said.
"Volunteer fires en route. Additional units notified."
Bernice had moved closer. She stood a few feet back from the opening, flashlight down at her side, eyes tracking the wall and the ceiling just inside. "There's a maintenance line tied into this system," Bernice said. "Runs under the old ball field." I nodded. "Big enough to walk?" "Well, parts of it," Bernice said. "Kid-sized most of the way." That mattered. If Nolan went in on his own, he might not have come back out without help. Kids panic underground. I've seen it before. They don't follow turns. They keep going until they're lost. An older man approached from one of the nearby houses, stopping short when he saw Bernice's posture. Bernice turned slightly toward him. "Sir, stay back, please." "I live right here," the man said. "Name's Lyle Drum. I saw the boy earlier." I stepped toward him. "What did you see?" "Well, he was riding his bike," Drum said, "near the basin." "You see anyone else with him?" I asked. Drum hesitated, then lifted his chin toward the culvert. I think I saw a clown." Bernice didn't move. "A clown?" I asked. Yeah, Drum began. It was standing near the storm drain. Real bright. White face." "Standing how?" I asked. "Well, it was just standing there," Drum continued. "Like he was waiting." I looked past him at the concrete mouth of the culvert. My mind did what it always does when someone says something that sounds like a story. It tried to set it aside so it wouldn't interfere with the work. I noted it. A clown by a storm drain. This wasn't Derry. A few minutes later, a kid about 10 years old stood near the edge of the road with his bike between his legs, watching the lights. Bernice walked over to him. "Hey," she said. "Did you know Nolan?" "Yeah," the kid said. "Did you see him today?" Bernice asked. "Yeah, he rode past me." "Did you see anyone else?" The kid nodded. "There was a clown," he said. Bernice didn't react. "Where?" she said. "By the drain," the kid said. "He waved at me." I keyed my radio again. "Harlan," I began. "Log multiple witnesses reporting a clown near the storm drain." There was a pause before Harlan answered. "All right, logged," he said. Volunteer fire pulled up with floodlights and began setting them up along the basin. The field brightened in sections, shadows breaking apart and reforming as the light shifted. I went back to my cruiser and pulled out a spare flashlight and a roll of barrier tape. I clipped the light to my belt and handed the tape to Bernice. "Keep people back," I said. Bernice nodded and started stretching the tape across the gravel access road. I studied the culvert entrance and looked in again. The concrete was damp. The ledge was narrow but usable. The ceiling overhead showed old stains and exposed rebar. Water moved slowly across the bottom, carrying leaves and debris toward the pond. I keyed the radio one more time. "Harlan," I said. "Russell and Bullock are preparing to enter the storm system at the retention basin." "Logged," Harlan replied. I stepped down out of the concrete lip and leaned into the dark. Bernice finished tying off the tape and moved up beside me. "Well, you ready?" I asked. Bernice nodded. "Let's go." I stepped inside, and Bernice followed close behind. The temperature dropped immediately. The smell changed too. Outside had been wet grass and standing water. Inside, it was concrete, rust, and something older. I took 2 steps in and stopped. The light from outside didn't reach far. The beam from my flashlight cut a clean tunnel through the dark, but everything beyond it stayed flat and featureless. "Wait a sec," I said. Bernice stopped without bumping into me. I planted my left boot on the ledge and shifted my weight slowly, testing it. The concrete was slick, but solid. The ledge ran just wide enough to walk single file without scraping the wall. Water moved along the bottom channel, shallow but steady, carrying leaves, twigs, and bits of trash that clicked softly as they bumped into each other. I took another step, then another. Each movement echoed back at us, delayed just enough to be distracting. Every sound we made came back thinner and stretched out. I raised my light and swept it along the ceiling. Old stains ran in long streaks where water had once flowed higher. Rust bled outward from exposed rebar, frozen in place like veins. The ceiling wasn't low, but it wasn't generous either. High enough to stand fairly comfortably, low enough that I kept checking it. Bernice walked behind me, her light angled slightly higher than mine. We didn't talk. There wasn't anything to clarify yet. 10 steps in, I stopped again and looked back. The entrance already felt farther away than it should have. The rectangle of daylight behind us looked smaller, framed by concrete and shadow. I could still see the barrier tape fluttering faintly in the breeze outside, but it didn't reach into the tunnel. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a roll of tape. "Marking entry," I said. Bernice nodded. I tore off a long strip and pressed it to the wall at shoulder height, smoothing it down so it wouldn't peel off in the damp. I added a second strip beneath it, angled toward the exit, then stepped back and checked that it was visible from both directions. "Entry marked," I said. "Copy," Bernice replied. I keyed my radio. "Harlan," I said, "we're inside. Entry point marked. Standing and walking."
Copy,
Harlan said.
signal's clear.
I took another step forward. The ledge stayed consistent, running along the right wall. The water channel widened slightly, deep enough now that I couldn't see the bottom through the surface reflection. The tunnel curved gently left. I slowed and checked the map again, unfolding it carefully and holding it flat against my thigh. "This should be straight," I said. Bernice leaned in enough to see without crowding me. "Map shows no curve." I folded it back up. "Yeah, we're not lost yet." We followed the curve. The tunnel widened again, just enough that the ceiling lifted and the walls pulled back. A maintenance walkway appeared along the left side, raised above the waterline. Its surface was rough and uneven, grooves worn into it by decades of boots and equipment carts. I stopped and scanned it. The walkway wasn't on the map. Neither was the ladder, bolted into the wall 20 feet ahead. It ran straight up into the ceiling, disappearing into darkness. The metal rungs were rested but intact, bolted deep into the concrete. There was no signage, no tag or warning. Bernice angled her light upward. "That's not on the plans." "No," I said. I didn't climb it or touch it. I noted it. I pulled out the chalk from my pocket and handed it back to Bernice. "All right, mark it," I said. Bernice knelt and drew a clearer arrow pointing back the way we'd come. She added a second arrow beneath it, then wrote a short note beside the ladder. I watched the water while she worked. It moved steadily, but the direction wasn't consistent anymore. In some places it flowed toward the basin. In others, it swirled back in on itself before continuing on. I keyed the radio again. "Harlan," I said, "we're at the widened section with a maintenance walkway and vertical ladder. Not on the map." There was a pause.
Repeat last.
Harlan said. I repeated it.
Copy.
Harlan said.
Stand by.
Bernice looked at me. Signal lag. Yeah, I said. And we moved on. The tunnel narrowed again after the ladder, funneling us back into a single ledge. The curve straightened out, then split. 2 passages opened ahead of us. One continued straight, the other angled down and right, the water there deeper and moving faster. I checked the map again. There shouldn't be a split, I said. I stood there with the map folded in my left hand and my light fixed on the junction. Bernice didn't say anything. She angled her light toward the right-hand passage first, then the left, checking ceiling height, checking the water, checking how far the beams carried before the dark swallowed them. I folded the map and put it away. Mark it, I said. Bernice stepped forward and pulled the chalk from her pocket. She knelt and drew a clear arrow on the wall, pointing back the way we'd come, then added a second mark beneath it. She marked both branches, identical symbols, same height, same spacing. When she stood back up, I could tell at a glance which way led out. We took the left passage. It narrowed almost immediately. The ceiling dropped just enough that I felt it without having to duck. The ledge thinned, forcing me to turn my foot sideways with each step. The water here moved faster, shallow but insistent, making a constant sound as it slid past the concrete. I slowed and checked my footing again. Easy, I said. Bernice stayed a step behind me. Her light tracked higher now, following the curve of the ceiling instead of the floor. We went another 20 yards before the tunnel straightened. The sound changed first. The water didn't get louder or quieter. It got hollow. The echo came back wider, stretched longer than it should have for the space we were in. I stopped and lifted my light. The tunnel had widened again. Not as much as the earlier section with the walkway, but enough that the walls pulled back and the ceiling lifted. The concrete here looked older. The seams were rougher. The stains were darker. I took one more step and stopped. Bernice, I said. I pointed with my light. At about knee height, along the right wall, something pale caught the beam. I moved closer, slow, careful not to smear it. White paint. It was thin, like it'd been dragged rather than applied. Not a handprint, not a shape. Just a streak that started clean and then broke apart, as if something had brushed past and carried part of it away. I held the light steady and leaned in. The paint had soaked into the concrete pores. Bernice stepped up beside me and angled her light across it instead of straight on. There's more, she said. She swept the beam forward. Another smear showed up 5 feet ahead. Then another, higher up this time, close to waist level. I reached into my pocket and tore off another strip of barrier tape. I pressed it to the wall above the first smear, then added a second strip angled back toward the entrance. Paint marker, I said. Bernice nodded. Got it. I moved forward again, slower now. The paint appeared in intervals, sometimes on the wall, sometimes on the edge of the ledge. Once, a faint streak ran along the ceiling where the concrete curved overhead. I stopped and raised my light higher. The ceiling here showed more exposed rebar than before. Some of it bent downward, some snapped flush with the concrete. Near one of the bars, a thin line of white paint ran along the curve, broken and uneven, like someone had passed close enough to brush it. I didn't say anything. We kept moving. A few yards later, my light caught something else. Footprints. They were faint at first, half filled with water, but the pattern was clear enough once I adjusted the angle. Small shoes, rubber soles. They ran straight down the center of the passage. I followed them with my light until they stopped. Yeah, not turned, not scattered. Stopped. The concrete beyond them was perfectly clean. No scuffs, no drag marks. Just water and bare surface. Bernice stepped up beside me and looked at the same spot. "They don't continue," she said. "No, they don't," I said. She swept her light ahead anyway, checking both sides, checking the ceiling. There was nothing else to follow. I keyed my radio. "Harlan," I began. "We've got confirmed child footprints inside. Paint markings present. Tunnel layout doesn't match county map." There was a burst of static before his response came through.
Copy.
Harlan said.
Say again on the markings.
"White paint," I said. "Multiple smears." Another pause.
Copy. Signal's getting weak.
Bernice looked back the way we'd come. The tape we'd placed at the last junction was still visible, but it looked far away now. The tunnel behind us seemed to stretch longer than it had when we walked in. I turned forward again and raised my light. The passage ahead dipped slightly and opened into a darker space beyond the reach of the beam. "We keep going," I said. Bernice nodded. We stepped forward together, and behind us, the water kept moving. The tunnel sloped downward more sharply, the ledge tightening until I had to turn my foot sideways again. The sound of the water shifted as we went, less open, more enclosed. Something moved ahead of us, fast, scraping, claws hitting concrete hard enough to spark sound. Water splashed up against the wall, then again, closer this time. Bernice stopped and brought her weapon up. I lifted my hand. "Hold." The sound came again, louder now, chittering and frantic, bouncing off the tunnel and coming back distorted. And then it burst into the light. A family of raccoons exploded out of a side channel on our left, bodies low and panicked, scrambling over each other as they ran straight at us. One slipped down the ledge and slid into the water before clawing its way back up. Another leapt past my legs, brushing my knee as it went. Bernice flinched back a half step, then froze when she saw what they were. "Raccoons," she said. They rushed past us and vanished into the darkness behind, water churning in their wake. For a few seconds, the tunnel was full of noise, splashes, claws, chittering. Then it settled again, echoes thinning out until only the water remained. I lowered my hand. Bernice lowered her weapon. "False alarm," she said. "Yeah," I replied. I swept my light ahead again, checking the side channel they'd come from. It was low and narrow, angled down and away. Nothing else moved. Bernice stepped forward. I turned to say something to her, and that was when my light caught her shoulder, and the space behind her. Something was standing there. It filled the tunnel from wall to wall. Tall, upright, a white face, red lines running from its mouth up towards its eyes, bright colors, puffy shapes where clothing should be. A clown. For a second, my hands didn't work. The flashlight dipped and banged against the concrete, and I caught it just before it hit the water. "Bernice," I started, but the clown lunged. It moved faster than it should have. One moment it was standing still, the next it was on her. Mouth open wide, teeth flashing as it clamped down on her upper arm just below the shoulder. Bernice screamed and slammed back against the wall, her feet sliding on the ledge. The clown released her immediately and twisted away, limbs pumping as it ran past me, feet slapping water and concrete as it disappeared down the tunnel ahead. I aimed to get a shot, but it was already gone. "Bernice," I said. She was on the ledge, clutching her arm, blood spilling between her fingers and dripping into the water below. It bit me," she said. I dropped to a knee and pressed my gloved hand hard over the wound. The bite was deep, skin torn, blood coming fast. I keyed my radio. "Harlan, officer injured." Static. I tried again. Nothing. Bernice's breathing was quick and uneven, her eyes fixed on the tunnel ahead. "Look at me," I said. She did. I tore my undershirt free, folded it tight, and pressed it down over the wound. I wrapped it hard, knotting it tight enough that she flinched. "Pressure," I said. She nodded and pressed her other hand over it. "Can you stand?" She pushed herself up against the wall, got her feet under her, and studied. Bernice was tough. "I'm okay," she said. I'm okay." I didn't argue. I tried the radio again. "Dead." "That's bad," Bernice said. "Yeah." She looked back the way we'd come, then forward again. "We should go back," I said. She shook her head. "Bernice, I want to find the boy," she said. "That thing still got him." I looked at her arm. The bleeding had slowed, but hadn't stopped completely. "You can still shoot?" I asked. "Yeah." I nodded. We brought our weapons up, flashlight steady, and moved deeper into the tunnel. After a few steps, Bernice spoke. "What the hell was that?" "A clown," I said. "What did it look like?" I kept my light forward. "Just a clown." I didn't tell her the rest. I didn't tell her about the white face that wasn't painted sloppy or cracked, but smooth and even, like it'd been applied with care. I didn't tell her about the red lines that ran from the corner of its mouth straight up towards its eyes, perfectly symmetrical, the kind of detail you only notice when something's close enough to hurt you. I didn't tell her about the orange hair, parted cleanly down the middle and flared out at the sides, stiff and dry looking, like it hadn't moved even when the thing did. I didn't tell her about the costume, how it sat on the body like it belonged there, ruffed collar, puffed shoulders. I didn't tell her about the teeth. They were sharp. The mouth opened wider than it should have. I didn't tell her that when the light hit it, there was a second where I questioned what I was seeing. I knew exactly what it was supposed to be. I thought I was looking at Pennywise. That clown. The one from It. But I didn't say any of that. It wouldn't have helped. I just kept walking. Bernice didn't push. She adjusted her grip on her weapon and stayed just off my shoulder, light moving with mine now, overlapping fields so there weren't gaps. The tunnel ahead dipped again, deeper this time. The water thickened, moving faster along the channel, carrying debris that bumped and scraped as it passed. The walls here were narrower, the ceiling lower. I felt the space pressing in without having to think about it. My radio stayed silent. I keyed it once more anyway. "Harlan," I said. Nothing came back. Bernice noticed. "Still dead?" "Yeah." She nodded and shifted her stance, keeping her injured arm tight against her body. Blood had soaked through the cloth I'd tied, darkening it, but it wasn't pouring anymore. We moved another 30 yards before I saw the next mark. White paint again. I stopped and raised my light higher. The ceiling above us caught the beam, and the paint continued there too, broken streaks running along the curve where something had moved overhead. Bernice followed my light. It went up there. Yeah, I said. We didn't discuss how. The tunnel widened ahead into a low chamber where several smaller pipes fed into the main channel. Water poured in from 2 of them in steady sheets, splashing hard enough to mask smaller sounds. Rust stained the walls in long vertical lines beneath each inlet. Something lay near the edge of the water. I stepped closer and knelt. It was a shoe, small and black, rubber sole. One of the laces was torn clean through, the ends frayed. Bernice stopped beside me. That's his. I picked it up and turned it once in my hand, then set it on the ledge where it wouldn't drift away. I think we're close, Bernice said. I nodded. And that was when we heard the sound, coming from deeper in the tunnel ahead. Something was moving toward us, fast. I raised my weapon and angled my light forward. Bernice did the same. Water shifted ahead of us. Bernice's light held steady on the tunnel mouth ahead. My beam cut a narrow cone through the dark. Beyond it, the tunnel swallowed everything. Then the sound changed. The scrape moved upward, higher now, closer to the curve where the wall met the ceiling. It came with a second sound underneath it, fingernails, or something like that, dragging quickly. Russell? I hear it, I said. The shape arrived in pieces before it arrived as a whole. A hand came first, pale and gloved looking in the beam, fingers spread wide as it gripped the wall. Then another hand, higher up, pulling. Then a head slid into view, upside down, clinging to the wall. The clown crawled out of the darkness. It wasn't walking, wasn't running. It used the tunnel like it owned every surface, hands and feet on concrete, climbing the curve, rolling onto the ceiling, then dropping down without losing speed. Its costume was perfectly intact. White ruffled collar, puffy sleeves, bright colors. The face was the part my brain latched onto. I hadn't been wrong before, even though I hoped that I'd imagined it, or seen it wrong in the darkness. But no, it looked exactly like Pennywise. It opened its mouth then. Teeth. Too many teeth. I fired. The first shot hit center mass and snapped its torso back against the wall. It didn't fall. It grabbed higher and kept coming. The second shot kicked off the concrete behind it. The third hit its shoulder and spun it slightly, but it recovered instantly, limbs gripping, body flowing back into its line. I fired again and again. The shots weren't clean. The target was not steady. It dropped from the ceiling and hit the ledge hard, then surged toward us on all fours, fast enough that the water beneath it broke into white spray. I fired until the slide locked back. The sound of the empty click was loud enough that Bernice heard it. Reloading, I said. The clown dropped in front of us then, landing low and springy, then lunging forward. Bernice still didn't shoot. Her gun followed its head like her eyes didn't care about anything else. And the clown launched itself at us. For a fraction of a second, it was airborne, arms spread, mouth open. Bernice fired one shot, and the round hit it square between the eyes. The clown snapped backward mid-lunge. It flew past us and slammed into the wall behind with a hard, wet impact that shook the tunnel. It hit the concrete, slid down, and collapsed onto the ledge in a twisted heap. It didn't twitch. It just lay there. Bernice lowered her gun but kept it pointed. "Got it," she said. "Yeah, good shot." I stepped toward the body with my light fixed on its head. Blood pooled beneath it and ran toward the channel, dark and thick. The makeup on its face started to smear where it struck concrete. The orange hair looked flattened on one side. Bernice took a step with me and then stopped, favoring her injured arm. The cloth I'd tied around her upper arm had soaked through. Wasn't pouring, but it was bleeding steadily. I kept my gun trained on the clown's head and moved in another step. And then the body changed. It wasn't subtle. The white face collapsed inward as if the structure beneath it had softened. The red lines warped and slid out of symmetry. The mouth shrank and then stretched again, reshaping. The ruffled collar sank down into the neck as if it were melting into the flesh. The puffed sleeves shrank, fabric tightening, and then disappearing into the arms. The clown's limbs lengthened, the elbows pushed backward, then snapped forward. The shoulders broadened and then narrowed again, like the body couldn't decide what it was supposed to be. Bernice stared. "Russell?" "I see it." The clown's head elongated. A snout pushed out where the nose had been. The face narrowed. The jaw reformed around different teeth. A deer took shape on the ledge. Not a clean deer. Its chest heaved once. Antlers pushed out of its skull, growing fast, scraping against the ceiling before stopping at an angle. Its legs kicked once, hooves scraping concrete. Then it stilled again. The deer's eyes were forward-facing for a second, and then they slid outward as the skull reshaped again. The antlers retracted into the bone like they were being pulled back inside. The body shrank. The deer collapsed down and became a dog-sized shape, ribs tightening, spine compressing, fur appearing and then vanishing. The head changed twice in a second, muzzle forming and unforming. Bernice swallowed hard. "What the hell is that?" "I think it's a shapeshifter," I said. The word sounded like it belonged in a movie, but the thing on the ledge didn't give me a better one. The body jerked again. For a second, it looked like it was trying to grow bigger into something with broad shoulders and a heavy chest. I raised my weapon, and I fired into it. I emptied the magazine until the slide locked back again. The echo slapped us from every direction. Smoke hung low in the tunnel and mixed with the damp air. My ears rang hard enough that the water sounded distant for a moment. The body shuddered once, then went still. I stood there with the gun raised, waiting for another change. Nothing happened. I looked down the tunnel again. Let's find the boy. Bernice's breathing was tighter now. She pressed her good hand against the cloth on her arm. "I'm still walking," she said. I looked at her wound. Yeah, you're still bleeding. We moved past the spot where the creature had fallen. I kept my light and my weapon trained forward, sweeping the beam across the walls and ceiling in slow arcs. The tunnel ahead dipped into a wider space. The air changed slightly. Water flowed faster here, fed by multiple channels we couldn't see. My radio stayed silent. I keyed it once anyway. "Harlan," I said. Just static. We went another 30 yards before I saw something that made me stop. A shoe sat on the ledge ahead, tipped on its side. Same kind, small and black. I stepped up and picked it up by the heel. The tunnel opened into a low chamber where 3 smaller pipes fed into the main channel. Water poured from 2 of them in steady sheets. Rust stained the walls beneath each pipe. The ceiling was higher here. I swept the beam around the chamber, and then I saw the balloons. Red balloons floated near the ceiling and along the upper curve of the wall, their strings dangling down. Some were tied off in clusters. Bernice stopped beside me. "What the hell?" I didn't answer. I moved my light past them and saw the boy. Nolan was in the corner of a side tunnel, curled on his side with his knees drawn slightly up, one arm tucked under his head like he'd fallen asleep in the wrong place. His red shirt was darkened with water, his hair plastered to his forehead. I crossed to him fast, careful with my footing, and knelt. I put 2 fingers to his neck. "Pulse." I checked his breathing. Shallow, steady. "He's alive," I said. Bernice let out a breath she'd been holding. I didn't waste time trying to wake him. I lifted him under the arms and got him onto my shoulder. His head lolled against my back as I turned. We didn't look at the balloons again. We just moved. The walkout was faster but not sloppy. I followed our markings. Tape strips, chalk arrows, places where I'd pressed a tape higher to keep it out of the water. The tunnel felt less wrong on the return. The curve that had bothered me earlier came back as a curve. The split appeared where it should have. The ladder was still there. Our tape marks were visible again. The white paint was gone. I noticed it when my light passed over the wall where it'd been. The concrete was bare. No paint. I didn't stop to argue with my eyes. Bernice noticed too. "Russell?" "Yeah, I saw it," I said. We kept moving. When we reached the entrance, the rectangle of daylight hit my face like a physical thing. Floodlights lit the grass outside. Voices carried from the road. Boots crunched gravel. Volunteer fire and EMS were waiting exactly where they were supposed to be. I stepped out and handed Nolan over to the first EMT who reached for him. Bernice came out behind me and leaned against the concrete lip, holding her arm tight. They guided her to a flat patch of grass and cut away the soaked cloth I'd tied around her arm. The bite marks were deep enough that the medic's expression tightened when he saw them. I crouched beside Bernice while they worked. I looked at her, smiling lightly. "You know you're still a good shot," I said. She held my arm for a moment and nodded. We'd known each other a long time, and I was glad she'd been down there with me. Later that night, after Nolan was stable and Bernice was in a room with her arm wrapped and stitched, I went back out with a full team. We entered the system with better lights, more people, and a plan. The tunnel looked normal. The chamber with the pipes looked normal. The corner where Nolan had been was empty. No balloons, no white paint, and there was no body. They found our barrier tape and our chalk marks. They found Bernice's blood where it splashed onto the ledge and dried. They found shell casings where I'd dropped them. They didn't find anything else that made sense. I kept thinking about why it chose that shape. Pennywise? Maybe it's seen the movie? Maybe a poster? I still don't know. I went home near dawn, washed the sewer stink off my hands until my skin burned, and then I called a friend 2 towns over. Sheriff Lost works Daggerland. I'd heard the stories coming out of that town. Every cop in Ohio had. The missing people, the deaths, the thing that came out of Lake Erie, the kill, and how a few men and a black German shepherd had finally stopped it. I'd never known what to do with any of it until now. Lost picked up, and we talked like 2 sheriffs talk when they're trying to keep their voices level. I told him there was something here too, something bad. He didn't act surprised. He didn't laugh. He didn't ask me if I'd been drinking. We said we'd get together soon, talk things over, try to figure out what was happening. I don't know what the hell's going on. I don't know if it's limited to Ohio or if it's spreading everywhere. All I know is this. There's something out there that almost got us, and you need to be very careful. That thing can look like anything, and I don't think it's done.
Killing a monster is not easy. Movies tell you it is. 1 silver bullet, 1 clean swing, and the thing drops. But the truth is worse. Real monsters don't fall the first time. They keep coming. And by the time you understand what you're really facing, it's already too late. Sheriff George Lost and his oldest friend, David Winters, sat in the small second-story office of the sheriff's station in Daggerland, Ohio. The window looked out over Main Street, porch lights glowing against the pool of Lake Erie. The room was quiet, heavy, the kind of silence that settles when 2 men have already said too much. It began with Samantha Granger, 8 years old, whose footprints ended at the bluff with no trace beyond. Then Josh Maddox. George and David had saved him at the last possible second. The Harpers tried to escape down Lake Road. Their SUV died. By the time help arrived, their children were the only ones left. The town mechanic, Marcus Wilkins, nearly gave his life saving those kids, bleeding out in the road while the creature grinned. And then Frank Greeley's trawler set ablaze on the water, the old man swearing something had struck the hull just before the fire. Every sign pointed to the same truth. Daggerland was marked. Bullets didn't matter. The rules didn't matter. Whatever lived in the lake wasn't finished. Now, George and David sat in the dim office, watching the town go still below them, both men knowing the same thing. Time was running out. The desk between them was buried under books, hardcovers, paperbacks, loose photocopies, a patchwork of anything that even whispered about monsters. Some came from the town library, spines cracked from decades of dust. Others had arrived in brown boxes on George's porch. A few had no publisher's mark at all, ordered from strange websites with names like hauntedstuff.com, their pages reeking of ink and mildew. There were bestiaries that read like novels, field guides on folklore, even pulp paperbacks with lurid covers, demons, lake serpents, ghost of the drowned. Half of it contradicted the other half. It was hard to know what was real, what was an old wives' tale, or what was just a writer's imagination. But they weren't leaving anything to chance. If there was a way to kill the thing in the lake, they'd find it. The coffee pot hissed in the corner, filling the room with the smell of burnt grounds and bitter steam. Muggs sat within reach, half drunk and cooling, as George flipped through a yellowed encyclopedia of cryptids while David scribbled notes on a legal pad. The sheriff's office felt less like a place of law and more like a college dorm at night. Two exhausted men trying to cram for a test they couldn't afford to fail. David rubbed his temples. We don't even know where to start. Half these books say monsters hate silver. The other half says they don't care. Fire, iron, salt, holy water. Take your pick. George didn't look up from his book. So we try all of it, he said. The silence pressed back in, broken only by the soft turning of pages and the tick of the wall clock. On the table, the books painted a fractured history of fear, but together, they told the same story. People had been seeing strange things in the water for as long as they'd been writing things down. There were stories of river demons that pulled children under, of fishermen vanishing without a trace, of something waiting in the dark. One paperback claimed some creatures only went for the liver, dense with iron, fat, nutrients. Predators choosing the richest prize. David read it aloud, voice low. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? George didn't answer, but his jaw set hard. One of the thinner volumes had come from a strange site online, half folklore and half conspiracy. It mentioned something called the Shakoy, a legend from the Philippines about a creature that dragged people under from the shallows, part human, part fish, with claws like hooks. David muttered, could be the same thing, different place, different name. Lore overlapped. Some said silver, others fire. A few swore by salt, by prayer, by iron. Nothing was consistent. For every book that promised a weakness, another claimed it didn't matter, that the monster always came back. David closed one with a snap. We're digging through 1,000 years of stories, and they all end the same way, he said. George stared at the mess of paper and ink between them. Then maybe it's on us to write a new ending. The clock ticked. The lake's water lapped against the shore. And in the sheriff's office, two old friends leaned closer to the mess of books, searching for the one thing no one else had found, a way to kill it. David thumbed through a dog-eared paperback, half folklore, half survival guide. His eyes snagged on a short passage. All right, hold on, listen to this. He read aloud. Some freshwater demons cannot survive in the ocean. Salt water burns them, weakens them, drives them away. Salt is their undoing. George leaned over, brow furrowing. Freshwater. David tapped the page. Maybe that's why it sticks to the leg. It's not just hunting here. It's trapped here. George reached for another book, flipping quickly until he found the line he remembered. His finger pressed against the page. Here, same thing. Known to consume the liver of its victims, avoiding other organs. Sensitive to salt. Strongest weakness believed to be silver. The room went still for a moment. David sat back in a chair, exhaling. Salt and silver. This might be as close as we're gonna get. George rubbed a hand down his jaw. Well, salt we can manage. Bags of it. Barrels if we have to. But silver, that's another story. David leaned back, eyes narrowing in thought. Not if Marcus is still breathing. You've seen his shop. He's got more than wrenches in there. Old kiln, scrap piles.
Hell, he's practically been running a forge for years. Fixes half the farm equipment in the county with it.
George frowned. That's a big leap from welding plow blades to making something that can kill whatever this thing is.
David's voice dropped. It's all fire and steel, George. If anyone can shape silver into something sharp enough to matter, it's him. The sheriff didn't answer right away.
He flipped the book shut, staring at the title on its cracked spine. Encyclopedia of Aquatic Aberrations. The leather was worn, the pages swollen with age, but the words inside had given them more than just fear. It given them direction. He set it aside.
Yeah, maybe Marcus can do it.
David leaned forward, elbows on the table.
And the salt. We don't just carry it, we use it. We line the boat, throw it at the thing. Whatever it takes to slow it down.
George rubbed his jaw, the day's stubble rough against his hand.
All right, well, then we'll need more than a few bags from the grocery store.
Whole pallets, if we can get them.
The clock ticked.
Outside, the wind pressed against the old glass panes, carrying the low hush of the waves. Finally, George stood, sliding the encyclopedia aside and reaching for his coat.
All right, we go to Marcus. If he can forge silver into something we can use, we put it in our hands. And the salt, we'll find enough of it. Let's just hope it works.
George rubbed at his eyes, then glanced at the duty roster tacked crooked on the wall.
It's just Mendez and Hawkins with me now. Watterson packed up and left town yesterday. He said he had family in Columbus and wasn't sticking around to see what else came out of that lake.
David gave a short nod, not surprised.
George exhaled. When they're back, we'll meet up and tell them what we've got. It's not proof. Hell, it's barely more than guesswork, but it's better than nothing.
The room fell quiet again.
David pushed back from the table, his chair legs scraping soft against the floorboards.
I should spend time with Owen today, he began.
His voice was low, almost apologetic. All this matters, but so does time with him. I just feel like I'm never there for him lately,
He rubbed a hand over his face, searching for words.
I thought about sending him away, inland, maybe out of state. But the truth is, I think he's safer here. God knows he wants to stay. And he's never alone. When I'm out, he's with Joe and Crichton every minute, and that dog doesn't let him out of his sight. Uprooting him, dumping him with strangers or distant family, it just feels wrong.
George studied him for a moment, then said quietly,
He's a good kid.
That pulled a faint smile out of David.
Yeah, he is. And he looks up to you, George. He's got it so deep in that damn head of his that one day you and him are going to be working together. Drives me nuts sometimes. I keep waiting for him to change his mind, to say he wants to be a fireman or a doctor or I don't know, something. But it's always a cop. Always.
George smiled at that.
Well, your boy is smarter than half the deputies I've trained, he said.
David shook his head, still smiling, but there was a tiredness behind it.
George leaned in slightly, voice low. You know your son loves you, Dave. You know that, right?
David's smile faltered just a little, but he nodded again.
Yeah, I know.
George held his gaze a moment longer.
I wouldn't be surprised if he was out on the lake one day, helping out, watching over people like you do.
David just nodded and forced a small smile.
The silence between them said the rest.
Mark Hanlon worked the lines loose at Edgewater Marina in Cleveland,
coiling each neatly before stepping back aboard. He'd already checked the bilge, cracked the hatches, sniffed for fuel, safety gear stowed, radio tested, tank topped. Every box ticked. "All right, forecast looks perfect," he said, settling into the helm seat. "Calm all day, light westerly winds. Couldn't ask for better." Across from him, his wife Ellen handed him a travel mug. "You always say that right before you start the checklist over again." Mark smirked but didn't deny it. "Well, habits keep us alive, honey." Their son Ryan sat forward with a folded chart across his knees, tracing the shoreline eastward with his finger. "So we'll go past Euclid, then Menor, Daggerland, Ashtabula, and Geneva on the Lake." Ellen glanced over, amused by his concentration. "Pretty good pronunciations. You sound like a tour guide." Ryan grinned and folded the chart carefully, tucking it beside him. Mark eased the throttle forward, the engine settling into a steady hum as the boat slipped out of the marina into open water. A low wake curled behind them as the Cleveland skyline blurred into the haze. They headed east. Marcus Wilkins looked like he'd been stitched together with wire and gauze. The lights of the hospital room gave his skin a gray cast. Machines hummed softly around him, each beep a reminder he was still holding on. When George and David stepped inside, Marcus shifted in the bed, trying to sit up straighter. He winced, cursed under his breath, then waved him off before either man could tell him to take it easy. "Oh, don't look at me like that," Marcus rasped. "I'm not dead yet." David pulled the chair closer to the bed, setting his forearms on his knees. "No one's saying you are, but you came close," he said. Marcus grimaced faintly, though it tugged at his stitches. George remained standing, his hat in one hand, the other resting on the back of David's chair. He studied the old mechanic for a moment before speaking. "Well, we've been going through everything we can get our hands on. Folklore, old records, whatever's out there." Marcus's tired eyes studied the men. "And?" David leaned forward. "Well, we think salt weakens it. Silver might be able to kill it." Marcus didn't say a word. He just sat and thought. "Salt and silver." He trailed off and nodded to himself. "My grandfather used to talk about things like that." George and David exchanged a glance. Marcus wet his lips, voice low but steady. "If that's true, if salt weakens it, then you can use it to slow the thing down. Blind it, burn it if you can. And the silver..." His hand twitched against the blanket, like he could feel the weight of a tool in it. "Silver, it has to be shaped into something that'll cut deep. A blade, a spike, doesn't matter what, as long as it gets through the skin." David leaned closer. "You think you can do it?" Marcus's eyes locked on his. "Well, you bring me the metal. Maybe I'll find a way. Soon as they let me out of this damn place, I'll be back at the shop. I can melt it down, shape it, give you something real to carry out there. I'd slow you down in a fight. Won't last 5 minutes on that water. But maybe I can still help." The room was quiet again, except for the monitor. Finally, Marcus nodded once, firm. "Bring me silver. Whatever you can get." George gave a firm nod. For a moment, the three men held each other's gaze, all of them battered in different ways, all of them bound to the same fight. George set his hat back on his head. "All right, get some rest, Marcus. We'll check in with you, okay?" Marcus nodded, leaned back against the pillow, and closed his eyes. Out in the hallway, George and David walked in silence until they reached the front doors. The night air was cool, carrying the faint smell of rain off the lake. George adjusted his hat, already looking toward the cruiser parked under the streetlight. "I'm heading back to the station. Mendez and Hawkins will be pulling in soon. I want them up to speed." David nodded. Yeah, I'm gonna check on Owen." For a second, neither spoke. Then George put a hand briefly on David's shoulder. "All right, I'll see you in the morning." "Yeah, see ya." They went their separate ways. George toward the sheriff's office. David toward home. Owen was already out in the yard when David pulled up, Crichton bounding at his side with a neon frisbee clamped between his teeth. The boy waved, the dog barked, and David felt some of the weight in his chest lift. "Hey, you two," David said, rolling his shoulders as he walked onto the grass. "Dad, catch!" Owen called, and heaved the frisbee. It sailed wide, but Crichton lunged after it, paws skidding in the dirt before he snagged it out of the air. He trotted back, tail wagging like a metronome, and dropped it at David's feet. David laughed despite himself and sent it spinning again. Owen tore across the yard with the dog like there was nothing more important in the world. And for a few minutes, that's all it was. Running, catching, laughing. Normal. When Owen collapsed out of the grass, gasping for breath, David lowered down beside him. Crichton flopped against their legs, chewing the edge of the disc. "Hey," David said quietly. I know I haven't been around as much as I should have been, since your mom." He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck, tired again. It's been hard, but I love you, right?" Owen sat up, still catching his breath. "Yeah, Dad, I know." David managed to smile, pulling the boy into a quick, tight hug before ruffling his hair. "Oh, you know, huh? Well, good." He smiled. Owen grinned and shoved at his arm. "You're sweaty." "Yeah, well, so are you," David said, giving him a playful nudge that nearly tipped him over. Crichton nudged the frisbee into Owen's lap, tail wagging expectantly. Owen laughed, pushing himself up. He cocked his arm back and sent the disc spinning across the yard. Crichton tore after it, paws thudding through the grass, leaping high to snatch it from the air. David whistled. "Not bad. That one actually went straight." Owen puffed out his chest. "Yeah, I told you I was getting better." David smiled and gave his son's shoulder a little squeeze. Crichton bounded back and dropped the frisbee at his feet. David snapped his wrist, sending it on a high arc. The shepherd sprinted, leapt, and came down rolling before popping up with the disc clamped tight. Both of them laughed as Crichton pranced back like he just won a trophy. For a few minutes, nothing else mattered. Just the boy, the dog, and the father, trading throws and laughter under a sky that hadn't yet gone dark. The sheriff's office was quiet, the kind of late-night stillness that made the old building creak. George sat at his desk, one lamp burning low, a mug of coffee cooling beside the radio. The base unit crackled.
"Sheriff's office, this is dispatch."
The voice was female, unmistakably civilian. Clara Hensley, who'd run the board for 10 years. She wasn't a sworn officer, but she was the one who kept the phones, the logs, and the radio calls moving along in an orderly fashion.
George thumbed the mic. Go ahead, Clara.
Got a call routed from Coast Guard relay. Family out of Cleveland. 30-foot powerboat. They lost their engine about 5 miles west of Palmer's Bluff. They're drifting. 2 adults, 1 child on board.
George straightened. Any injuries reported?
Negative,
Clara said.
but the family's scared. They tried to drop anchor, but it's not catching bottom, and they're still drifting. They sound pretty panicked.
George pressed a hand against his brow, picturing a dead boat rolling east with the current, a family sitting helpless on deck while the lake moved beneath them. He keyed the mic. What's their position again? Clara came back.
5 miles west of Palmer's Bluff, closest landmark they gave was a lighted buoy just north of their track. Currents pushing them inshore.
Static flared, then Mendez cut in.
Sheriff, we're within 5 minutes of the marina. Hawkins and I can be on the water fast.
George checked the clock on the wall. He was at least 20 minutes out. He pressed the key. No, negative. Hold position. Wait for me to get there. I don't want you going in alone. Static filled the gap for a moment. Then Mendez's voice came back, firm.
Sheriff, by the time you're on the water, that family could be pushed into the rocks. They've got a kid aboard. They're already panicked. We can't just sit here.
George's fingers drummed against the desk, the tick of the wall clock loud in his ears. 20 minutes. He pictured a powerless boat, anchor dragging, a family huddled under a canopy while the lake nudged them closer to a rocky shore. Another pause. Her voice returned, clipped but steady.
We've got sidearms, flares, radios. We're not helpless. And if we sit on shore waiting for backup, we're not deputies either. You taught me that.
George closed his eyes. In the glass of the office window, he caught the faint reflection of his own tired face, worn, hollow. Too many nights replaying the same losses. Samantha, the Harpers, Marcus almost dying on the asphalt. Finally, he pressed the key again, voice rough. 10-4, launch from the marina. Get eyes on him. And you stay in contact every minute, you hear me? I'll be there as fast as I can.
Copy that.
Mendez said.
We'll bring him in.
George set the mic down and grabbed the keys, the shotgun from the rack, and a box of shells. Shaking his head, he even snatched the half-empty salt shaker off the table, knowing damn well it probably wouldn't do a thing. He wished he had more time. The gravel lot at Daggerland Point Marina crunched under George's tires as he pulled in. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried the wet metal smell that always came before a storm. Headlights cut across the rows of empty slips until they landed on David's truck already parked near the dock. David climbed out, a half-torn bag of road salt slung over one shoulder. He gave a short nod, jaw tight, and dropped it into the patrol boat with a dull thud. Hey, left over from winter. Figured it's better than nothing. George tossed the shotgun case aboard, checked the radio, and scanned the deck with quick, practiced motions. His face was pale under the dock lights, but his hand stayed steady. The base unit crackled once, then nothing. George frowned, thumbed the mic. Mendez, Hawkins, you copy? Static. He tried again. Mendez, report. The radio hissed, then fell silent. David glanced at him, worry plain in his eyes. How long since you heard from him? Too long. George's voice was flat. He clipped the mic back into place and reached for the ignition. He paused, looking over at David. You don't have to come, you know. I can handle the boat well enough myself. David shook his head before George even finished. Not a chance. You're not going out there alone. Dave, George began. We're not ready yet. And if something happens to you, I'm coming with you, George. David interrupted. That family's out there. Mendez and Hawkins are out there. Now let's go. For a moment, the two men just stared at each other, the boat rocking gently against the dock. Then George gave a slow nod and stepped back. David slid behind the wheel, turned the key, and the outboards rumbled to life. Saltbag braced against the console at his knee. All right, hang on. The patrol boat nosed out of the slip, spray catching the dock lights as it cut into the dark water. George braced himself on the rail, eyes fixed on the black horizon ahead. For just a moment, he let himself remember another night on the water. Him and David as boys, sneaking Joe's old skiff out past the breakwall, laughing like idiots as they pointed the bow towards Erie's endless dark. Two kids daring the lake to take them. Now, years later, the same two men were headed back into that same dark. Older, heavier, and carrying the weight of the whole town on their shoulders. But they weren't ready. The patrol boat cut through the black water, bow light sweeping pale arcs across the chop. Spray hissed along the hull, every splash louder than it should have been. Neither man spoke. David eased the throttles back as a shadow took shape ahead, a white fiberglass hull drifting broadside to the current. The Hanlon's boat. Its running lights glowed weakly, casting red and green streaks over the water. A thin fog had rolled in with the current, soft and uneven. It shifted across the decks, swallowing details until the bow light caught them. Beside it, tied clumsily along the port rail, another shape floated. Smaller. The county patrol skiff. George's gut sank. He didn't have to say it aloud. David brought them in slowly, engine hum dropping to a low growl. Both boats rocked against each other in the dark, their lines creaking with each shift of the current. No movement on deck. No voices. The fog thickened in patches, curling over the rails, softening the outlines of empty chairs and windows. A child's life jacket lay abandoned near the stern, half shrouded in mist. On the county skiff, the floodlight still burned, its beam cut to ribbons by the haze, aimed uselessly out across the water. There was no one there. David throttled into neutral. The three boats, theirs, the patrol skiff, and the Hanlon's cruiser, knocked gently together in the current, the sound too ordinary, too normal. George scanned the decks, eyes narrowed. No sign of Mendez. No sign of the family. His voice was low, even, but David could hear the tension in it. The wind carried across the water, and the boats rocked again. The sound of rope straining against cleats filled the silence. For a long moment, neither man moved, just listening, just waiting. The fog pressed in closer, damp and heavy, muffling even the slap of water against the hull. It was the kind of quiet that felt wrong, not peaceful, but eerie. David finally reached for the cleat line. Let's tie up. George nodded once. Stay together. No splitting up. Wouldn't dream of it, David replied. David looped the rope and hauled the patrol boat against the skiff. The hulls kissed with a hollow thud, then settled into a slow rhythm with the current. George chambered around in the shotgun, the click loud in the fog. You board first, I'll cover. David slung the salt bag higher on his shoulder, hand brushing the pistol at his hip, the one George always made him bring, just in case. He stepped across the gap, boots landing on fiberglass that creaked under his weight. George was right behind him, shotgun raised. The fog curled low across the deck, carrying the faint smell of brine and something else. David swept the beam of a handheld flashlight along the deck. The mist caught the light and blurred it.
revealing only fragments: an overturned cooler, a towel stiff with lake water, the empty life jacket by the stern. He swept slower, steady, letting the light crawl across the deck. The fog smeared every edge, made every shape look wrong. He paused at his shadow by the cabin door, heart ticking faster, then let out a breath when it turned out to be nothing more than a folded deck chair half collapsed against the wall. George's boots creaked behind him, shotgun steady at his shoulder. The patrol skiff rocked against the cruiser, ropes groaning, as though the lake was tugging at them, impatient. David angled the light lower. Something dark streaked across the non-slip decking, faint but unmistakable. His jaw tightened. "George?" The sheriff stepped up, peering down. Smears, drying, worked into the tread. Blood. A few feet farther on, the beam caught metal. A gun lay on its side, half slick, the polymer grip streaked crimson. George crouched, eyes hard, shotgun never wavering from the shadows. He reached out, thumb and forefinger lifting the pistol by the trigger guard. "Issued," he muttered. "Mendez." The word hung between them. David's flashlight beam trembled slightly as he swept it across the deck again, over the cooler, the towel, the streaks of blood leading nowhere. The fog curled heavier, blurring the rails until the lake seemed to vanish just beyond arm's reach. And then it came, a sound cutting through the quiet. A splash. Not the sharp crack of a fish, not the roll of a wave. Heavy, deliberate, something breaking the surface and sinking back down again. Both men froze. David swung the flashlight toward the sound, its narrow cone slicing into the mist. White glare caught nothing but churned ripples fanning out into the dark. George rose slowly, shotgun following the beam. His jaw clenched. That wasn't a fish. Another knock sounded, not from the water this time, but from the hole. A dull thud, just beneath their feet, as if something large had brushed the underside of the boat. The two men locked eyes, breath tight, waiting for the next sound. David turned the flashlight toward the small cabin hatch. "Family might have gone below," he said. George nodded once, motioning him forward. They moved to the steps, the air inside thicker, worse. David put one foot down, then another, his beam shaking as it swept across the cramped space. The light caught the floor first. Red. Dark, tacky smears pooled deep in the non-skid grooves. Then more, shapes half buried in shadow. Arms, a leg twisted wrong against the bulkhead, torn fabric. David stumbled on the step, boot skidding in something wet. He caught himself on the rail, breath catching. My God. George reached down, pulled him back with one hand on his shoulder. His own face was pale, jaw set hard. They didn't need to go any farther. Not down there. They backed up, step by slow step, until they were back in the open air. Fog curled thick around them, swallowing the railings, muting the world until the deck was nothing but a circle of pale light in the dark. George and David turned instinctively, standing back to back, weapons raised, breath tight. They could barely see more than a few feet ahead. The lake was gone, the sky gone, only the shifting gray pressing close, waiting. Then the hull shuddered. A wet, heavy thump from outside, the kind of weight that didn't come from water. George steadied the shotgun against his shoulder. David's flashlight beam swept the fog, wide arcs catching nothing but mist. Another knock. Closer. Against the rail this time. They tightened their stance, backs touching, eyes straining. And the thing came at them from the dark. A shape burst through the fog, taller than a man, shoulders slick, claws flashing. George fired point blank, the shotgun roaring across the deck. The blast tore through the mist, but the thing didn't slow. It hit them like a truck. George and David were thrown hard across the wet fiberglass, boots skidding, shoulders slamming against the rail. The shotgun spun from George's grip, clattering across the deck. David's flashlight pitched forward, its beam whipping through the fog before it fell and rolled, casting crazy arcs of light. The boat lurched under the impact, cleats groaning, lines straining as water slapped against the hull. The fog shifted, and for a second, the thing was only a silhouette crouched on the deck, grinning, claws dragging slowly across fiberglass, leaving gouges in its wake. George groaned, pushing himself up to his feet, eyes darting toward where the shotgun landed. He staggered forward, desperate, while David scrambled beside him, grasping frantically at the deck. His pistol was gone, somewhere in the shadows, lost in the spray and fog. George lunged for the shotgun, fingers closing around the stock, and the creature's claw came down. It raked across his arm with sickening force, nearly severing it at the elbow. George froze, a sound caught in his throat, staring at the torn mess hanging from his shoulder. And then the thing slammed into him again, hurling him to the deck. The shotgun skittered away as the creature pinned him down, claws pressing into his chest, its grin wide and dripping. It lowered one long claw and gently tapped the place just above his liver, lingering there. David staggered up, eyes wide. His pistol was gone, but the salt bag lay burst open nearby, spilling across the boards. He grabbed a double handful, grit biting into his palm, and flung it into the creature's face. The effect was instant. The thing shrieked, staggering back from his friend, claws flailing as steam hissed off its slick skin. It clawed at its own eyes, blinded, writhing in the fog. David snatched another handful and threw it, then another, each one driving the thing backward across the slick deck. Step by step it retreated, stubborn, violently shaking its head against the burn. David's boot struck something hard. His pistol? He snatched it up, leveled it with both hands, and squeezed the trigger. The first shot cracked, then another. Bullets struck home this time, the creature lurching with each impact, black fluid spraying as it staggered near the rail. But still it held, crouched low, ready to charge. Then the shotgun boomed. George, pale and swaying, had braced the weapon in a crook of his good arm, teeth gritted against the pain. The blast tore through the creature's chest at close range. This time it groaned, a low, guttural sound, and toppled backward over the rail. The lake swallowed it whole, leaving only ripples that spread into the fog. George let the shotgun slip from his grip and sagged against the deck, blood running from his arm, his head rolling weakly to the side. His lips parted as if to say something, but only a faint breath came. Then his eyes fluttered shut. and there was only darkness. David dropped to his knees beside him, pressing a hand to George's chest. Terrified for a moment, he'd stopped breathing. Relief surged when he felt the shallow rise and fall. Weak, but there. Blood pumped steadily from the ruined arm. David swore under his breath, yanked his belt free, and looped it high above the wound, just below George's shoulder. He pulled it tight, then tighter still, until the bleeding slowed. Not enough. His eyes darted across the deck. A broken bit of railing lay loose near the rail. He jammed it through the belt loop and twisted, cinching it until George let out a faint moan. The flow finally eased. Wasn't perfect, but it would hold. Only then did David hook his arms under George's good shoulder and drag him across the slick deck, boots slipping in blood and salt. Every tug felt heavier than the last, but he got him to the patrol boat and heaved him over the rail, laying him flat on the deck. That was when he heard it, muffled cries rising from the cabin below. David froze, listening. The sound of a woman's sob, a child's whimper, and a man's voice trying and failing to sound steady. He moved back to the Hanlon's boat, shoved the hatch open, and swept his flashlight inside. 3 faces blinked up at him through the gloom. A woman clutching a boy against her chest, the man in front of them, a tiny pocket knife shaking in his grip. His eyes were wide, terrified, but he was ready to stand between whatever came through that door and his family. "It's all right," David said quickly, lowering the light. "I'm here to get you out." The man's shoulders sagged with relief. The knife clattered against the deck as it slipped out of his hand. One by one, David helped them up and out. The boy first, then his mother, then the father, each scrambling onto the patrol boat where George lay pale and still, his arm bound tight. David climbed aboard last, shoved the throttle forward, and the engines roared. The patrol boat tore away from the drifting cruiser, spray curling off the bow as he pointed them toward the faint light of Daggerland's shoreline. The patrol boat slid into Daggerland Point Marina, bumping against the fenders as David eased the throttles back. Red strobes already lit the docks. Not 1, but 2 ambulances waiting with their crews. The paramedics were on George in seconds, easing him onto a stretcher, eyes checking the belt tourniquet cinched around his arm. His skin was gray, lips bloodless, but his chest still rose and fell. "Is he?" David's words caught in his throat. "How bad?" One medic pressed gloved fingers to George's neck and looked up without stopping. "Pulse is weak. He's lost a lot of blood. We'll do everything we can." They pushed off toward the waiting ambulance, wheels rattling on the dock planks. George's pale face disappeared behind flashing red as the door shut and the siren carried him away. Behind them, Ellen Hanlon clutched her son, both of them shaking. Another medic was already ushering them into the second ambulance. He said there were minor injuries, but they needed to be checked out. Within minutes, that rig pulled away too, its siren fading into the fog, and the marina was quiet again. Headlights swung in across the lot. A battered pickup rolled to a stop, brakes squealing. Joe Winters climbed down stiffly, one hand on the doorframe. The passenger side banged open, and Crichton hit the planks at a run. The black shepherd bounded to David, pressing his head into his ribs, tail thrashing once before he went still, nose working the damp air. David dropped to one knee, fingers digging into the dog's coat. "Good boy," he whispered, his throat tight. He stood as his father approached. "What are you doing here?"
Joe's voice was gruff. "Heard the call on the scanner, thought I could help. What happened out there?"
David let out a shaky breath, still resting a hand on Crichton's neck. His eyes looked hollow in the dock light. "It was bad. I don't know if George is going to make it. That family was trapped, and if we'd been a minute later..." He stopped, rubbing a hand down his face. "You don't want the details?" Joe frowned.
"You're talking like it was something more than a busted engine."
David shook his head slowly. "It wasn't an engine, Dad. You know it wasn't. We saw it again. It came up on the boat. Nearly took George. It would have taken me too if the salt hadn't slowed it." Joe stiffened.
"David?"
"I'm telling you the truth," David interrupted. He looked down, knuckles white against Crichton's fur. "It's real, Dad. I wish to God it wasn't, but it is." Joe's voice came out low, but sharp.
"You said the same thing when Claire got sick.
You saw signs. You thought you knew better. You wouldn't even let her try the chemo." David's head snapped up. "Don't. She might still be here," Joe pressed, his voice breaking. "If you'd tried to talk her into it." David's face twisted, pained. "It wasn't my choice. It was hers, Dad. That's what Claire wanted. She didn't want to spend her last months hooked to machines, sick and miserable. She wanted to live life while she could." Joe's eyes shone wet in the docklight, but his voice was harsh. "She wanted hope, and you just let her throw it away because it was easier than fighting." David shook his head hard, voice hoarse. "I loved her enough to let her choose. Do you think that was easy for me? Watching her waste away while I prayed for one more good day? You weren't there, Dad, not like I was." "I loved her too," Joe snapped, his face lined with grief as much as anger. For a long beat, neither man spoke. It struck David then that this was the first time they'd said Claire's name aloud since the funeral. All of it had been bubbling under the surface for months, festering in silence, waiting for a night like this to finally tear loose. Crichton's growl deepened, claws scraping the planks, but neither of the men noticed. Joe's voice cracked when he spoke again. "That boy needed his mother. God knows he still does. And instead, he's left with you chasing monsters and ghosts." David's face darkened. He broke away, pacing a few steps down the dock, hands pressed hard against the back of his neck. Crichton padded close behind, head low, growl rising as his ears tracked the black water beneath the pilings. David spun, frustration boiling over. "Sit." The shepherd dropped to his haunches instantly, whining low in his throat, eyes never leaving the leg. "Crichton, stay," David said. Crichton froze, muscles rigid, ears pinned forward. His chest rumbled with a warning growl he couldn't swallow down, but he obeyed, whining softly, eyes still locked on the dark water below. David turned back toward his father, anger burning through his exhaustion. "Don't you dare say I failed, Owen. Don't you dare." The fog pressed tighter, swallowing the edges of the dock. Crichton's growl built to a low, shaking rumble in the silence, But the men were too far inside their grief and anger to hear. David kept pacing, boots thudding softly on the wet planks. His voice was ragged now, torn between fury and grief. Crichton's growl rose sharp and sudden, silencing the men. The shepherd stared down, ears flat, teeth bared at the black gap between the pilings. David barely turned his head before something cold and black shot up from the water. A claw snapped around his ankle and yanked. He gasped, the sound more shock than scream, as his legs went out from under him. His arms hit the boards hard, scrabbling to grab a hold of something, but his legs were already in the water. It was dragging him down. Joe dove, grabbing for his son's wrist, but the grip below was too strong. David's eyes flashed up at his father's face, and then the lake claimed him, ripping him down into the darkness.
Ohio emergency alert. All law enforcement in Daggerland is either dead or critically wounded. If you are a citizen, evacuate immediately. As of now, there is no one left to protect you. If you cannot leave, lock your doors, arm yourself, and stay away from the lake. Something is out there.
I worked as a Navy SEAL for some years. We'll just call me John. I'm not going to spend time on my background, my training, or the path that got me here. None of that matters for what follows. The only thing that matters is that I was part of a job that took me to a lot of places most people never see. And that job put me in situations where paying attention to small details was not optional. Most deployments are exactly what you'd expect. Long stretches of preparation, movement, and waiting. You learn routes, check gear, move from one position to another, and try not to create problems for yourself. The work rewards people who stay calm. You notice what's in front of you, you deal with it, and you move on. A lot of time is spent in environments that are unfamiliar. Jungles, deserts, mountains, open water. Each one comes with its own set of practical issues. Heat, cold, visibility, footing, sound. You learn how those things affect you and your equipment, and after a while you stop thinking about them consciously. What doesn't get talked about much is how different places behave differently, even when nothing is technically wrong. Sound doesn't always travel the way it should. Distance doesn't always feel consistent. Sometimes things appear closer or farther than they are. Sometimes movement catches your attention for no clear reason. Most of the time, those moments pass without incident and you forget about them later. Occasionally, they don't. I'm not talking about danger in the normal sense, not enemy contact, not accidents, not close calls that make good stories later. I'm talking about moments where something doesn't line up and there's no immediate explanation for why. When you work in a team, you learn quickly not to chase every odd sensation. If you reacted to everything that felt slightly off, you'd never get anything done. You log what you can, stay focused on the task, and keep moving. Most of the time, that's the right decision. Over the years, I was present for a handful of situations where that approach didn't fully resolve things. Events that didn't escalate, didn't turn violent, and mostly didn't get anyone hurt, but also didn't fit any category we normally use to describe what happens on an operation. What made those moments different was how consistent they felt afterward. Different locations, conditions, people. The same sense that something had occurred just outside the scope of what we were trained to notice. None of this interfered with the work. We completed missions, moved on, didn't dwell on it. That's how the job functions. You don't stop to assign meaning to things unless they demand action. These, well, most of them didn't. I'm not presenting this as a single story or a connected chain of events. The things I'm describing didn't relate to each other in any obvious way, and I don't think they're part of some larger pattern. They're just a small number of moments that stayed clear in my memory long after everything else blurred together. I've had time since to think about what stood out and what didn't. Not in the sense of trying to solve anything, but in the sense of noticing which details never faded. The ones that stayed sharp were never the loud ones or dramatic ones. They were the quiet moments where something was present, acknowledged, and then left alone. What follows are a few of those moments, written the way I remember them. Nothing more. The Philippines deployment took place along the southern coast, in an area where jungle pressed right up against the water, and the ground never fully dried out. Even at night, the air stayed thick. Sweat soaked through gear faster than you expected, and every step had to be placed carefully to avoid roots, shallow pools, and soft ground that would give under your weight. We were moving inland from the shoreline, single file, with enough spacing to maintain visibility without stacking up. The water stayed to our left, dark and slow-moving, broken occasionally by mangroves that reached out like fingers. To the right, the jungle closed in almost immediately. Visibility dropped to a few yards in places, with vegetation layered so tightly that anything moving inside it would be half hidden unless it crossed a clear gap. The operation itself was straightforward. Confirm what we needed to confirm, then pull back out the same way we came in. No expected contact, no time pressure. The kind of movement where discipline matters more than speed. About 20 minutes in, something to the right caught my attention. Wasn't a sound. It was movement that didn't match everything else. Leaves shifted without the usual delay. Branches flexed without snapping. Whatever it was stayed just inside the tree line, moving parallel to us, never stepping fully into view. Well, at first, I assumed it was an animal reacting to our presence. The area had plenty of wildlife. Usually, though, animals bolted once they realized people were nearby. This didn't bolt. We took another dozen steps, and the movement stayed with us. Same distance and angle. When we slowed, it slowed. When we adjusted slightly to avoid a wet patch near the water, it adjusted too. I didn't call it out yet. There was no sudden threat, no reason to stop the whole line over something that might resolve itself. And then it crossed an opening between two trees. Just a flash at first. A shape passing through a narrow gap where moonlight filtered down. I caught enough to register that it wasn't low to the ground. Moved upright. Fast. It didn't bound or scramble. It ran. I raised my fist and the line halted. Everyone froze. Nobody spoke. The jungle continued its background noise like nothing had changed. I scanned the tree line carefully, watching for another break in movement. For several seconds, nothing happened. I gave the signal to move again, and as soon as we stepped off, it moved too. This time it stayed closer, crossing thinner vegetation where there were fewer layers to hide behind. I got a clearer look. It was on two legs, there was no mistaking that. The stride was long and even, the upper body angled forward as it ran. It was lean, narrow, and taller than it should have been for something moving that fast through tangled growth. The radio clicked in my ear. You seeing that? The point man asked. Yeah, I said. That was all that needed to be said. The thing stayed with us for another minute or two, pacing us exactly. Never rushed or hesitated, never broke cover completely. It stayed just visible enough that I knew it was there, then slipped back behind leaves and branches before I could focus on details. The color registered clearly now. Green. Not bright or reflective, the kind of green that blends into vegetation until it moves. I never saw a face, never saw eyes, just a smooth outline passing through gaps faster than my brain wanted to process. At one point it crossed a wider break, maybe 15 feet across. and I got the clearest look I was gonna get. 2 legs, upright posture, long stride, no gear, no weapon, no human movement pattern. I keyed my mic again. "Don't follow it." The acknowledgement came back as a click. Nobody argued or suggested otherwise. A few seconds later, the movement changed direction. It simply peeled off deeper into the jungle and disappeared, as if it had reached the edge of whatever line it had been following. And we continued the operation. No further movement, no additional contact. We completed what we were there to do and moved back toward the water the same way we'd come in. Nobody brought it up after. There was nothing to add. Nothing had escalated. No action had been required. But later that night, back at the staging area, gear laid out and checked, the point man sat across from me, scraping dried mud off his boots with a piece of metal. He didn't look up when he spoke. "That thing back there wasn't human." "No, it wasn't," I replied. He nodded once and went back to what he was doing. And that was the end of that. We rotated out of that area a few days later. No similar reports or warnings passed down. No indication that anyone else had encountered the same thing. At the time, I treated it the way I treated anything that didn't interfere with the mission. I noted it and moved on. What stuck with me, it wasn't how fast it moved or how close it stayed. It was something else. You know, animals react. People react. This didn't react. It paced us, maintained distance, then disengaged without any visible reason. Years later, after other deployments and other environments, that memory has stayed sharper than most. There was no confusion in its movement, no hesitation, no adjustment once it started pacing us. It behaved like something that already understood what we were and where we were going. At the time, I didn't try to describe it beyond what I saw. I didn't label it. That wasn't useful. Much later, with enough distance from the moment to be honest about it, there was one comparison that fit better than the others. Not perfectly, but close enough. I realize this is going to sound crazy, but it looked like a giant lizard. The Afghanistan deployment came later, during a stretch where most of our operations took place in higher elevation terrain. The mountains there don't feel dramatic when you're first inserted. They feel dry, empty, and repetitive. Long ridgelines, narrow passes, rock everywhere. You learn quickly that sound behaves differently at altitude, especially in places where stone walls and cuts funnel it in directions you don't expect. The operation started as a movement through a mountain pass we'd used before. Not often, but enough that it wasn't unfamiliar. The route wasn't marked on any civilian map, but it was known, and it was considered safe enough for transit. But there were steep slopes on both sides, loose rock underfoot, and wind that cut through gear even during daylight. We were moving mid-morning. Visibility was good. No weather issues, no indication of contact in the area. The kind of movement where your attention stays on footing and spacing more than anything else. About halfway through the pass, I noticed the steps. First, I thought they were natural. Rock formations in that region can stack in ways that look deliberate from certain angles. But as we moved closer, it became clear that this wasn't erosion or chance. The stones formed a descending path, cut into the mountain, narrow but consistent in width and height. They went down. Not steeply at first, just enough to pull your eye away from the pass and toward the darker space below. I slowed and raised my hand. The line stopped. I crouched and examined the nearest step. The edge was worn smooth. I didn't say anything yet, but everybody could see it. The steps descended into shadow, curving slightly as they followed the shape of the mountain. The air coming up from below felt cooler, still. Even the wind seemed to stop at the top of the stair. Well, we debated briefly over comms whether to bypass it entirely. There was no operational reason to go down there, but there was also nothing that marked the area as restricted or dangerous. No signage or mention in any briefing. And in that environment, old structures weren't unheard of. Afghanistan is layered with things that predate modern borders by centuries. We descended. The steps narrowed slightly as they went down, forcing us to adjust spacing. Light dropped off quickly. The walls on either side rose higher, the rock face closing in. And the stairway opened into a cavern. Not a cave in the natural sense. The space was too regular. The walls curved deliberately, forming a wide cavern that extended beyond the reach of our lights. The ceiling rose high enough that the beam didn't find it right away. There were markings on the stone, not writing, carvings, shallow and worn, and repeating in patterns that didn't seem decorative. They ran along the walls at consistent heights, like markers rather than art. We moved slowly, scanning, light sweeping. There was no movement or sound beside our own. And then the statue came into view. It dominated the center of the cavern, carved directly from the stone floor. A spider, detailed enough that individual segments were visible where light struck the surface. It was enormous. The body alone rose higher than our heads. The legs spread outward, anchoring it to the cavern floor in a way that made it feel less like a statue and more like something frozen in place. The surface was smooth in some areas, rough in others, as if different parts had been exposed to different conditions over time. The scale was what hit me first. The craftsmanship came second. Whatever had made this had known exactly what they were doing. The proportions were deliberate. The posture was deliberate. This wasn't a rough carving or an old marker. The cavern felt very old. We started to approach the statue when someone grabbed me hard by the shoulder. I spun, bringing my rifle up instinctively, and came face to face with a senior SO I recognized immediately. He wasn't part of our movement. He didn't raise his voice, but he grabbed my gear and pulled me backward toward the stairs. "Off limits," he said. The rest of the team froze, watching. "You all didn't see anything." That's all he said. There was no explanation or elaboration, just the statement. We moved. Nobody argued or asked questions. Whatever authority he carried was enough that the decision didn't feel optional. We ascended quickly, the air warming as we climbed. The sound of wind returned. Radio sounded normal again. When we reached the top, the pass looked exactly as it had before. The senior SO stayed below, out of sight. We rerouted without discussion. The operation continued along an alternate path that added hours to our movement. Nobody mentioned the cavern over comms. Nobody tried to revisit it. Later, back in our staging area, I looked for the senior SO and he wasn't there. Nobody seemed surprised by his absence. I asked one quiet question to someone who'd been around longer than I had. He shook his head once. "Don't," he said. And there was no report filed or note made. No mention of the steps, the cavern, or the statue in any documentation I saw. The area wasn't flagged officially, but it never appeared in our routing again. Over time, I learned that some places don't get marked on maps. They get handled differently, avoided without explanation, redirected around without comment. At the time, I didn't try to assign meaning to what we'd seen. Whatever that place was, we weren't meant to be there. The Iraq incident. Now, this happened after the fighting was over. That's important, because it rules out most of the explanations people reach for later. There was no incoming fire, no confusion about where we were, no adrenaline pushing things out of focus. The engagement had ended cleanly, and the area was secure. We were doing what comes next, clearing, checking, moving methodically through what was left. The air smelled burnt. Not smoke exactly, but sharp mix of dust, metal, and something chemical that settles in your clothes and doesn't leave. The sun was low, throwing long shadows across broken concrete and collapsed walls. The heat was draining fast, replaced by that dry evening chill that creeps in once the light starts to go. We were moving through the remains of a small cluster of structures, not much left standing. Walls blown open, roofs collapsed inward, rubble everywhere. You had to watch your footing or you'd roll an ankle on loose stone or step onto something that shifted under your weight. A light mist started rolling in from lower ground. It stayed low, hugging the ground, moving slowly between debris and pooling in shallow depressions. We spread out, maintaining visual contact. And that's when I noticed the ground moving. It wasn't shaking or collapsing. It was moving. Subtle at first. A slow displacement beneath the mist, like something pushing from underneath instead of across the surface. The motion traced a shallow curve through the debris, about 30 yards ahead of us. We halted immediately. The movement didn't stop. It slid forward, smooth and continuous, passing behind a broken wall and reappearing on the other side. The mist parted around it, flowing over something solid instead of drifting freely. I stared at it, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with anything familiar. Dust settling doesn't behave like that. Neither does smoke. The shape emerged more fully when it crossed an open gap between piles of rubble, and it was long, thick, continuous. A single body moving as one piece. No visible limbs, no side-to-side motion. It advanced by pressure alone, sliding forward like something forcing its way through the ground without resistance. The radio clicked.
"Are you seeing this?"
One of the guys asked. The shape continued moving, angling slightly downhill. It never turned towards us or reacted to our presence. It behaved like we weren't there at all, and then it passed close enough that I could see detail. The surface was rough, not smooth. Earth and debris clung to it as it moved, and then fell away behind it. The mist swirled and closed in its wake. Whatever it was displacing ground as it went, not just sliding across the surface. "Is that a snake?" the guy beside me asked. I watched it move, watched how the ground responded around it. "I think it's a worm," I said. That was the closest comparison I had. The thing slowed as it reached a shallow depression near the edge of the structures. One of the bodies from the engagement lay there, partially obscured by debris. And the movement changed. The front end of the shape, if it even had a front, rose slightly, then pressed downward near the body. The ground shifted, and debris slid inward. And I still don't know if I imagined what came next. I swear I saw that body move. At least I think it did. I saw it move downward. There was no sound, no tearing or collapse, just displacement and then absence. The mist settled. The worm-like shape continued forward for another few yards, then sank lower, its outline fading as the ground closed above it. And within seconds, it was gone completely. No hole remained. No disturbed soil beyond what was already there from the engagement. If I hadn't been watching the exact spot, I wouldn't have known anything had changed. No one spoke. My brain kept replaying the moment, checking angles, lighting, distance, looking for something that could explain away what I thought I'd seen. I gave the signal to move. We advanced cautiously, stepping through the area where the thing had passed. The ground felt solid underfoot. No soft spots or signs of tunneling. No drag marks. Nothing that suggested something massive had just moved through it. But the body was gone. We finished clearing the area without incident. No further movement. No additional mist beyond what drifted naturally with the cooling air. That night, while we were staged and waiting, the same guy who'd spoken earlier sat down across from me. He rested his helmet on his knee and looked at the ground between us. "That thing," he said. "I wasn't imagining it. I think it took that body." I didn't answer right away. "I don't know," I said finally. And he nodded slowly. He didn't push it, and neither did I. That was the last time we talked about him. I have replayed that moment more times than I care to admit. You know, fatigue can do strange things. Smoke and mist can distort depth. Your mind can connect movements that aren't really connected. But two of us saw the same thing. We both saw the shape, we both saw where it went, and the body was gone afterward. Heavy things leave traces, though. Even when they disappear underground, something remains. There was nothing. Whatever that thing was, it passed through, took the body, and then left. The Somalia incident happened at night, during weather bad enough that most units would have postponed movement if they had the option. We didn't. The storm came in fast off the coast, pushing inland with heavy rain and wind that flattened scrub and turned dry ground into slick mud in minutes. Visibility dropped to almost nothing between lightning flashes. When the thunder rolled through, it didn't echo so much as smear across the sky, long and low, like the sound couldn't decide where to go. We were moving through terrain, low trees, scrub, open stretches broken by shallow washes and clusters of rock. Not the kind of place where you lose people easily, even at night. The spacing was tighter than usual because of the weather, but we maintained visual contact. Headlamps stayed off, and we relied on flashes of lightning. That was when one of our guys went missing. There was no shout or call over comms, no sudden break in formation that would have drawn attention. One moment he was there, moving just ahead and to my left, and the next he wasn't. We stopped immediately. I counted heads twice before saying anything. Same result both times. We called his name quietly over comms. No response. Tried again, louder. Still nothing. Rain hammered down hard enough that it masked anything smaller than thunder. Wind tore through the scrub in uneven burst, flattening at one moment and letting it spring back the next. We backtracked along our exact path. Same spacing and order. No sign of a struggle. No dropped gear. No disturbed ground beyond what the storm was already doing on its own. The missing guy was not careless. He was not inexperienced. He wasn't the type to wander or break formation. He was big too. 6'4", 240. Built like somebody who didn't get moved unless he decided to move. Well, we widened the search and controlled arcs, keeping line of sight when we could. And that was when someone spotted the backpack. It hung from a tree well off our path, silhouetted against the sky during a lightning strike. For a split second, it didn't register as anything more than debris caught in branches. Then another flash hit, and the shape resolved clearly. It was his pack, hanging at least 50 feet up. We moved toward it as carefully as the terrain allowed. The rain made everything slick, branches whipped in the wind. When we reached the base of the tree, I tilted my head back and followed the line of the trunk upward. The pack was suspended from a thick branch near the top, swaying slightly in the wind. No rope or cord, no fabric snagged or torn. It was just hanging there. I stared at it for a moment, trying to find a practical explanation. Something that fit the environment. Something that fit the man. He didn't climb trees. At least I'd never seen him do it. And there was no way he could have climbed that high in the dark, that quickly, in a storm, with full kit. There were no scrape marks on the trunk, no broken branches below, nothing on the ground. The storm surged again, wind roaring through the scrub, rain hammering down sideways. For a few seconds, the noise overwhelmed everything. Then it stopped. Not the storm, just the wind. It dropped off suddenly, leaving rain falling straight down instead of sideways. And that's when we heard it. Not a sound from the ground. Above us. A rush of air, heavy and fast, like something large passing overhead at speed. There was no shape to it, no silhouette against the clouds, just the unmistakable sense of mass moving through space right above the tree line. It lasted maybe a second, then it was gone. The wind surged again immediately afterward, branches whipping and rain slashing sideways like nothing had happened. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, someone broke the silence. "Did you hear that?" We stood there longer than we should have, rain soaking through gear, lightning flashing intermittently overhead. The pack continued to sway gently in the wind, untouched, and we resumed the search. We covered every direction, expanded the radius, checked the washes and low ground, looked for any sign of movement, any place someone could have fallen or been pulled. But the storm worked against us, erasing tracks almost as soon as they were made. But even accounting for that, there was nothing. No blood or torn fabric, no displaced ground that didn't already look like storm runoff. Eventually, Command called it, not because we were satisfied we weren't, but because there was nothing left to search. The weather wasn't improving. The risk to the rest of the team was rising. We recovered the backpack, lowered it carefully, and it was intact, nothing missing or added. His gear was inside, arranged the way he always kept it. We never found him. The area was searched again later, in daylight, after the storm passed. Different teams, better visibility. Same result. No body, no trace. There was no official explanation offered beyond the usual language used when something doesn't fit. Separated, lost, overwhelmed by terrain. None of it accounted for the pack. None of it accounted for the type of man he was. And none of it accounted for what we heard overhead. The loss stayed with us. Men don't just disappear like that. And storms don't hang backpacks 50 feet up in trees. The Norway incident took place during a cold weather training rotation, the kind meant to remind you how small mistakes turn serious much faster once water and cold are involved. We were operating offshore at night, far enough out that there were no lights on the horizon, no shipping lanes nearby, no land visible. The sea was calm in a way that only happens occasionally in that part of the world, flat enough that the water reflected the sky instead of breaking it up. Cold air, steady breathing. Everything slowed down by temperature. We were moving at low speed, maintaining spacing and running passive systems. No reason to make noise or rush. Just steady movement through open water while everyone stayed alert for anything that didn't belong. At first, nothing did. The water rolled beneath us in slow, heavy swells that barely registered against the hull. You could hear it more than feel it. A low, constant sound that blended into the background until you stopped paying attention to it consciously. That changed when the water beneath us darkened. It was a gradual shift in tone, like a shadow passing under glass. At first, I assumed it was a whale. That made sense. The region supports large marine life, and whales surface and dive without warning. Their mass can distort water patterns in ways that look unnatural if you're not expecting it. I adjusted my stance and leaned slightly, trying to get a better angle. The shape beneath us was enormous. It wasn't long and narrow like most whales. It was broad and smooth. The surface didn't break the water, it just stayed below it, moving slowly enough that the displacement was almost gentle. The shape slowed, then it stopped. The water above it stilled in a way that caught my attention immediately. The natural movement of the sea didn't resume. It was as if something solid had pressed upward and held there. I was still thinking whale when the eye opened. There was no build-up, no ripple, just a slow separation in the darkness beneath the surface, revealing a single massive eye opening directly upward. It was positioned at the top and center of the body, oriented straight toward us. And the color registered first. Red. Bright, deep, and saturated red, like something lit from within rather than reflecting light from outside. The surface of it was smooth and wet, catching what little ambient light there was and bending it in a way that made depth hard to judge. But the scale hit. The eye alone was enormous. Later, when I tried to put numbers to it, 50 feet across was the closest estimate that didn't feel exaggerated. It filled most of the visible space beneath us, stretching wider than the boat itself. No pupil detail stood out, no blinking. It simply opened and remained open. Nobody moved. I felt the instinct to step back, even though there was nowhere to go. The cold air felt sharper all of a sudden, like my lungs had decided to remind me where I was. The water around the eye remained unnaturally still. No bubbles or surface break, just that massive shape holding position directly beneath us. Close enough that if it had surfaced, it would have displaced the boat easily. Someone behind me breathed out slowly. For a few seconds, I waited for it to react, for the eye to track movement, for the body to shift, for anything that suggested it was aware of us in a way that would require action. Nothing happened. The eye stayed open, fixed and unblinking. If it was looking at us, there was no way to tell. And then the eye began to close. As it did, the water above it darkened again, returning to its earlier tone. The stillness broke, small ripples spread outward, then larger ones, as if the sea had remembered how it was supposed to act. The shape beneath us began to sink. The shadow grew deeper, broader, then stretched downward until it faded into total darkness. There was no wake or turbulence, no sign of disturbance beyond what we'd already seen. Eventually, the senior officer gave the order to continue, and we did. The rest of the night passed without incident. No additional movement, no return of the shape. The sea remained calm all the way back. I replayed it in my head afterward many times. We never encountered it again, not in that area or anywhere else. And I never saw another eye like it. But I think about that moment sometimes when I'm near open water, especially at night. Because whatever that thing was, it existed there long before we passed over it. And I have a feeling it's still there today. Well, I left active duty years ago. Not because of anything in this story. My time ended the same way it does for most people in that line of work. Rotations end. Bodies wear down. Life moves forward. You pack up what you can carry and you leave the rest behind. Most of what I remember from those years blends together now. The days, the briefings, the places. A lot of it fades the way it should. That's normal. You don't need to hold on to every detail to know who you were or what you did. I don't think about the moments I talked about every day. I don't connect them to each other. I don't look for patterns. That kind of thinking doesn't really help. What I do think about, occasionally, is how easy it is to assume that unfamiliar things behave the same way familiar ones do. Most of the time, that assumption works. Animals act like animals. Terrain acts like terrain. Water behaves like water. Sometimes, though, you run into something that doesn't react at all, doesn't escalate, doesn't retreat, doesn't acknowledge you in any way that fits your expectations. It simply exists alongside what you're doing, briefly, and then it's gone. I never felt chased in any of those moments. Never felt hunted, really. Even in Somalia, when one of our own disappeared, there was no sense of pursuit afterward, no lingering presence. Things happened, and then they didn't. I've had people ask me, in different ways, whether I think those things are still out there, whether I think they're connected, whether I think they were meant to be seen. I don't know. I don't think that question matters as much as people want it to. I don't tell these stories as a warning, and I don't tell them as proof of anything. I'm not asking anyone to believe anything. I'm just describing what I saw and what happened afterward. That's it. I don't avoid jungles, deserts, mountains, or open water because of this. I still go outside. I still travel. I still pay attention to my surroundings the same way I always did. But I'm more comfortable now with the idea that the world isn't obligated to make sense just because we think it is. Some places have rules that don't include us. Some things don't care whether we understand them. And sometimes, the only reason you're allowed to leave a place is because you got lucky.